Biography X, Lives of Real People.
Subscribe to the channel, like it, and leave comments. Enjoy listening. Part 1. Rise. Chapter 1. Michael Jackson and the Beginning of History. In this book, we will not only trace the life and career of Michael Jackson, but also attempt to understand him as a person and find answers to the question of why his life is surrounded by so many scandals and mysteries. But no matter what the story of the great Jackson, it always begins in one place, the small town of Gary, Indiana. To understand Michael Jackson's family and himself, it is necessary to delve a little into the history of their hometown. Today, Gary is a dying city, where all you can find are crumbling, abandoned buildings, from schools to the majestic local cathedral, whose roof collapsed many years ago. Most people here live below the poverty line, and many lack the means to buy basic necessities. In 2019, Business Insider dubbed Gary America's most wretched city. However, the city's situation wasn't always so clear-cut. Built at the beginning of the last century on the site of a small village, Gary attracted workers from the U.S. steel plant located right on the outskirts of the city. As a result, the town reached its population peak by the 1950s. At the same time, it became a key point of the Great Migration, the mass movement of Black Americans from the agricultural South to the industrial North. This would later lead to a complete change in the city's population. Many white residents began rapidly selling their homes and leaving the city, at least for the nearby suburbs. Then came the decline of the steel industry, which resulted in a loss of jobs and an increase in crime in Gary. It was at this point in 1950 that Joseph and Catherine Jackson purchased a small house in the town at 2300 Jackson Street. The coincidence between the street name and the family's surname was a coincidence. The two-bedroom, one-bath home, clad in red brick and aluminum, cost the family $8,500 with a $500 down payment. They had married just a year earlier, on November 5, 1949. They bonded over their love of music. Joseph played the bass guitar, and Catherine was a country music fan. Let's get to know the parents of the future music legend a little better. Joseph grew up with 4 siblings and was the eldest child. Their father was a stern man, and the children were raised under endless restrictions and prohibitions. Joseph and the other children were forbidden from hanging out with their peers or making friends outside the family. When Joseph was a teenager, his parents divorced, and he remained with his strict father. He later dropped out of 11th grade and began competing in amateur boxing tournaments. He inherited his father's callousness and harsh parenting methods. Catherine's childhood was no less difficult. She was a sickly child. She contracted polio, for which there was no vaccine at the time, and was constantly hospitalized, which made her shy, quiet, and gentle. She struggled to make friends. Miraculously, when these two opposites, the stern Joseph and the gentle Catherine, met, they immediately fell in love, even though Joseph was already married to someone else. Of course, he divorced a year later, and he and Catherine began building a family. Immediately after purchasing a modest home, they began having children. The family would continue to grow almost every year for a decade. This demonstrates how passionate their relationship was during those years. The first child to be born was Maureen, nicknamed Ribby, on May 29, 1950. Then came their second son, Sigmund Esco, Jackie, on May 4, 1951, and on October 15, 1953, Tariano Adaril, Tito, was born. After them came Jermaine Lawan, born December 11, 1954, Latoya, born May 29, 1956, Marlon, born March 12, 1957, and finally, Michael Joseph, born August 29, 1958. After him, 2 more children were born into the family. Stephen Randall, born October 29, 1961, and Janet DeMay, born May 16, 1966. The 9 children's childhoods were far from happy. Not only did they live in a declining town that was already losing its former appeal, but they also had to cram into a house that, according to the family, was the size of a garage. Their parents always assigned them chores around the house, mopping the floors, washing the windows, or mowing the small patch of grass near the house. As mentioned earlier, jobs in the city were becoming increasingly scarce, meaning finding well-paying work was difficult. Joseph earned about $65 a week, never enough to feed his large family. Catherine had to sew her own clothes, and the family's diet consisted of the most basic foods. They also struggled to heat the house properly. In winter, the family kept the oven on in the kitchen. Joseph's upbringing was strict, and the gentle and quiet Catherine couldn't resist. The children were forbidden from socializing with friends outside of school, from hanging out after school, and there was a curfew for all children. Of course, such strict safety regulations were partly due to the city's growing crime rate. Businesses were closing, wealthy people were leaving, and work was becoming scarce, leading to pogroms and looting. While Joseph imposed strict rules on the children and went from his shift at the inland steel plant to American foundries, Catherine, though devoting most of her time to the children, also worked occasionally. She also had deep religious convictions, which eventually led her to join the Jehovah's Witnesses. She converted to this branch of Protestantism when Michael was 5 years old. Naturally, the children were also instilled with the unusual rules of this religion. Witnesses did not celebrate birthdays, Christmas, or even Easter. They judged people in this faith solely by their good deeds, which, in their view, included missionary work and door-to-door visits. This modest yet stable family life for the Jacksons did not last long. In the early 1960s, Joseph lost his factory job and had to bounce from one part-time job to another to support his family. Life became even more difficult than before. This was the environment Michael grew up in for the first few years of his life, and that's how his story began. But very soon, the Jackson children would discover music, and everything would change forever. Chapter 2. The Jackson Juniors and Music. At some point, one of Joseph's side hustles became a real band. The Falsons, a group of friends of Joseph and his brother, played rhythm and blues in local bars and clubs, which certainly earned them a little extra money, but it still didn't provide a full-fledged income. Joseph's eldest sons, Jackie, Tito, and Jermaine, often watched the band's home rehearsals. It was at this point that they became fascinated with music and became obsessed with it. The Falcons didn't last long. After their breakup, Joseph decided to put music on hold, hid his guitar in his bedroom closet, and ordered it never to be removed. He didn't want to see the symbol of his unfulfilled dream, or he didn't want anyone to touch it. Either way, music was forbidden in the Jackson household. However, while their father was away, one of Catherine and Joseph's sons, Tito, would secretly take a guitar from the closet and teach himself how to play. Catherine allowed her older children to play music. They would sing and play various songs together, most often Catherine's favorite country songs, such as You Are My Sunshine and Cotton Fields. One day the television broke, and we all had nothing to do in the morning, so we started singing. My mom, my brothers, and I sang together. Then we started performing in competitions and various concerts, winning first prizes. That's how it all began, Michael Jackson said in an interview with AM Washington, September 24, 1976. The secret time between mother and children didn't last long. A couple of months later, Tito accidentally broke a guitar string, making it impossible to hide their musical activities any longer, although Tito himself hoped that everything would be all right and that his father wouldn't notice. Joseph finally saw a broken string on his favorite guitar and flew into a rage. He wasn't the kindest person, as I've already written, but he often went too far. Joseph Jackson hit his children, punished them, yelled at them, hit them with his fists, a belt, anything he could get his hands on. This time it was Tito who got it. Later the boy tried to justify himself to his father, wanting to tell him he could play. Then Joseph ordered him to demonstrate, and the boy, along with his two brothers, Jackie, 9, and Jermaine, 6, performed what they'd been rehearsing for months. Tito played guitar, and the boys sang along. He knew we liked the guitar. He'd put it in the closet and say, "Don't touch the guitar while I'm at work." But we were kids, so all we heard was, "Get the guitar." I played it for several months. My mother allowed it, even though she knew it was forbidden, but she saw the progress and allowed it. And then one day I broke a string. I didn't know what to do, how to replace it, what kind I needed. I couldn't even buy a new one. When my dad came home and saw it, he was really upset. He kicked my ass, then sat me down on the couch and said, "Show me what you can do." From an interview with Tito Jackson. After this, Joseph became obsessed with the idea of passing on to his children his passion for music and the dream of performing on stage, which had been cut short with the Falcons. Rehearsals at the Jacksons' home became regular, and as a sign of reconciliation, Joseph gave Tito a new red electric guitar. Where he got the money for such an expensive purchase remains a mystery. When I found out my kids wanted to be performers, I really started working on them. While other kids were playing in the streets, my boys were working at home, trying to learn something about life, to achieve something. From an interview with Joseph Jackson for Time magazine. At that time, the Jacksons were joined by their neighbor, a boy named Milford Hyde. He had his own drums, and he could play, so Milford became part of the Jacksons' band. The boys rehearsed twice a day before and after school. Hanging out with their peers or staying late after school had always been discouraged, but now it was strictly forbidden. Only rehearsals existed. In 1962, their younger brother Marlon, then 5, joined the boys. The family rarely appeared in public. They were constantly engaged in music. By that time, even the Jacksons' neighbors considered their reclusive lifestyle strange and frightening. And that's before their future frontman Michael had even joined the band. No one knew about his musical talent. He was too young. He was only 4 years old. But one day, while Catherine was babysitting the children and Joseph was at work, Michael began repeating and humming a James Brown song. He would later become Michael's role model and one of his greatest inspirations. Catherine, of course, heard him, and that evening Joseph, too, knew about the vocal abilities of one of the younger Jacksons. At first, Michael's older brothers didn't want to accept him into the band, so his only option was to perform at school concerts. At one of these, to which parents were invited, according to Catherine Jackson, Michael's mother, he performed an aria from the musical The Sound of Music, and so impressed the family that even his grandfather, Joseph's father, shed tears. It was after that school concert for his parents that Michael Jackson became part of the band and joined the endless rehearsals. According to Michael himself, he remembered little from that period of his life. After all, he was only 5 years old. He undoubtedly always recalled the arduous rehearsals, too tiring and long for a 5-year-old, but he nevertheless insisted that he enjoyed playing music, singing and dancing, and that he did all of this entirely voluntarily. The Jacksons had a common cause that now united the entire family, but one problem remained constant: Joseph's violence. Chapter 3. Joseph Jackson and Domestic Violence. He was so eager to show he cared about us, even if it meant hitting us, he was trying to protect us. From Jermaine Jackson's interview with ABC News. There was always this facade, smiling for the cameras, but at home it was different. We lived a completely different life. It was really, really hard. My father was very strict. He hit us. With belts, fists, anything. When my brothers got older, he would hit them so hard they would fall down the stairs, and it was constant. From an interview with LaToya Jackson during the promotional tour for her autobiography. I wasn't even 8 when he started hitting me. And I don't remember what I did. I can't remember if I could have deserved it. I tried to call him Dad once, but he said no. He said, "I'm Joseph to you. Call me Joseph." From an interview with Janet Jackson for CNN. If he hit me, I'd try to hit him back, and then I'd run out of the house and hide. It was terrifying, Michael Jackson said in an interview with ABC. According to Michael's siblings, he was too soft and vulnerable for Joseph's harsh parenting methods. Not only could their father beat their children, but he could also frighten them. For example, when they forgot to close the windows in their little room at night, Joseph would climb through the open window wearing a mask and yell at them just to teach them a lesson. Despite all this, in his autobiography, Moonwalk, Michael thanks his father for preparing his children for the brutal music industry ensuring that they could never be deceived, and for not taking all the money for himself or exploiting the children solely for his own gain. Speaking about growing up with Joseph, Michael only mentions that he never got to know his father and their personal relationship was frosty. With each passing year, Michael distanced himself further from his father, growing closer to his mother. He was much more like her, and a strong bond grew between them, while his bond with his father faded. Michael and I had a special relationship. He always said he was a lot like me, and I always said, "I see myself in you, but I don't want you to be like me." I said that because I didn't want him to be as trusting and soft as me, but that's exactly what he was, Katherine Jackson said in the 2011 documentary Michael Jackson, The Life of an Icon. And yet, despite Joseph's extreme cruelty and coldness, in new interviews, the older children often defend their father, saying that such an upbringing was necessary so that they wouldn't end up like children from other poor families in Gary, becoming drug addicts or criminals. Joseph feared his children would end up poor or forced to work in the same factory where he toiled, a place that, according to friends and family, was a living hell. Of course, the Jacksons' parents didn't want such a fate for their children, and they raised them to be strong and disciplined enough to escape Gary. Unfortunately, they knew only one method of parenting that they believed could contribute to this: violence. Furthermore, in Joseph's defense, the younger Jacksons recount how he sometimes took his sons fishing and taught them boxing and self-defense. However, at the same time, he generally ignored his daughters. And of course, now he and his sons had an idea, a genuine shared goal, to get a record deal and become great musicians. Chapter 4. Talent Competitions and Financial Disputes. In 1964, the Jacksons entered their first talent competition. They attended a show at Roosevelt High School, performed The Temptations' My Girl and Robert Parker's Barefootin', and won. It was then that Michael first demonstrated his dancing skills, taking off his shoes right on stage and dancing to the opening of Robert Parker's hit. From then on, the Jacksons would attend all the local competitions and sometimes even travel outside of town. Thanks to their meticulous and diligent preparation, they won prizes at each competition. It's important to note that such competitions were much more significant back then than they are today, and were truly a stepping stone to a serious record deal and a professional career. At such competitions, artists could not only be noticed by people in the music industry, but also had the opportunity to build a professional portfolio. So the Jacksons weren't just touring small competitions for fun or as a hobby. They wanted to build a career and secure a contract. Soon, the Jacksons' lives became a constant trek to nearby cities and competitions. They'd go to school in the morning, return home by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, where their father was waiting with his instruments ready for rehearsal. After 4 hours of work, the boys would pack up and head to a performance at the local club, Mr. Lucky's, or head to Chicago for another competition. Between performances, they tried to do their homework. The Jacksons didn't return home until 3 or 4 in the morning and went straight to bed. The next day, the cycle repeated itself. As you might imagine, a normal childhood and the usual fun was out of the question. For each 40-minute concert at the club, they earned about $7. The one who enjoyed these performances the most, of course, was their 8-year-old lead singer, Michael, who actively tried to imitate James Brown on stage. Incidentally, Jackson will have many parallels with the life and work of the legendary artist. Brown, also born and raised in dire poverty, began his musical career with the group Famous Flames, performing classic melodic gospel and R&B. Then James Brown, realizing his strength, began experimenting. His music breaks all the canons of popular music of the mid-1950s and 1960s. Melody and lyricism give way to rhythm and groove. Some of Brown's compositions don't even have a clear structure. He relies solely on a rhythm section, vocal techniques, and a knack for delivery. Brown would later become the founder of modern soul, hip-hop, and disco. His legacy would make rhythm the primary structural element of music, and the musician himself would earn the nicknames the Godfather of Soul and the hardest-working man in the music industry. James Brown would become the second most famous artist of his time, second only to Elvis Presley. But for black people, he would remain number one, although he would later manage to endear himself to white Americans, just like Michael. His performances, his approach to performance, and his music would become key influences for Michael Jackson. He would later admit that no one influenced his work more than James Brown. "When I saw him move, I was mesmerized. I had never seen an artist perform like James Brown, and after I saw him, I knew that's what I wanted to do for the rest of my life." Michael Jackson, speaking at James Brown's funeral, 2006. As the Jacksons' performances increased, so did the group's expenses. Joseph spent enormous amounts of money on new instruments and trips to various cities near Gary. This quickly became a problem and greatly worried Catherine. According to her, she and Joseph argued and fought a lot about her father's spending, but ultimately he always had the final say in their family. So all of Catherine's words about how they were barely making ends meet and sometimes didn't have enough money for food went almost unnoticed. Chapter 5. Chitlin Circuit and the Music of Black America. Michael, of course, was the lead singer in the band. His older brothers Tito and Jermaine played guitar, Jackie played tambourine, and one of the younger brothers, Marlon, simply complemented the group without being an outstanding musician. In reality, the band had more musicians, including keyboardists and drummers, but they were never considered permanent members or part of the group by the Jackson family. Furthermore, they changed periodically. The original name of the band was the Jackson Brothers, but it was later changed to a more recent and unusual name. According to legend, at one of the band's performances in a department store, Joseph was talking to model Evelyn Leahy, who told him that Jackson Brothers was a completely overused name and suggested another option, which would later become famous across America, the Jackson 5. A couple of years after adopting the group's official name, the brothers found themselves performing in various cities, joining the so-called Chitlin Circuit, a nationwide network of venues for black performers. The unifying name for these venues didn't appear in literature or the press until 1972, but concerts for black performers, including vaudeville acts, theater troupes, and musical groups, had been booked by the Ferguson Brothers Talent Agency since the 1940s. Over the course of their touring careers, the agency's artists developed a rather impressive list of theaters, concert halls, and nightclubs that most frequently hosted black acts. These included both prestigious venues and more modest venues. Among the performers themselves, there was a kind of gold standard. You became a big star if you performed at the four most important venues: the Regal Theater in Chicago, the Howard Theater in Washington, D.C., Uptown in Philadelphia, and the Apollo Theater in New York. Incidentally, while performing at the Apollo Theater, young Michael Jackson first met Etta James. Etta is considered one of the first artists to combine rhythm, blues, and rock and roll in her music. She, by her own admission, personally taught Michael her stage techniques and offered a few tips. By going on stage and watching experienced musicians, young Michael learned various tricks and techniques from them, and at the same time, he studied the stage, how it was structured, how to best present himself, and what he could do. Different biographers of Michael Jackson assess the impact of his involvement with the Chitlin Circuit very differently. It's important to understand that by the late 1960s, the music industry was clearly divided into white and black, and these two realms almost never intersected. So, on the one hand, the Chitlin Circuit turned Michael into a first-class black artist who could flawlessly sing so-called black music. Basically, everything was up to the standards of the time. But on the other hand, by the time the Jackson 5 joined the circuit, it had already lost its former influence and significance, and they, in turn, became a new trend, the first teen idols among the black population. They changed the perception of circuit artists. For the first time, youth magazines like 16 and Fave had artists their own age to publish. This allowed the Jacksons to become known to white Americans. At the same Apollo Theater, where the audience already knew the band well, they were beloved by the local public, the Jackson 5 won another talent competition. But this time, instead of a cash prize, they were offered the opportunity to open for Michael's idol, James Brown. The group's popularity grew at an incredible rate. In 1968, when Michael was 9, the Jacksons secured their first recording contract offered by Steeltown Records, a local label in their town. The group's first 2 songs were Big Boy and We Don't Have to Be Over 21. Of course, this music wasn't exactly a huge success, but it did give the band their first recorded songs. At the same time, the boys, through their performances, began to earn enough money to support the whole family, even buying a color television for the home. Things were far from smooth for the family during this period. The Jacksons were traveling more and more, and Joseph, the father, while in other cities, indulged in adultery and frequented various bars. Rumor has it that he even took his sons, including Michael, to strip clubs, which of course could have traumatized Michael and affected his future, but there is no evidence of such visits. In parallel with his performances, Joseph Jackson was also trying to attract the attention of various labels and recording studios. He sent the few recordings of the Jackson 5 to every possible outlet, but his greatest interest was, of course, the then-famous Motown Records. He tried to reach its president, Berry Gordy, and sent the group songs, but received no response. However, the silence did not last long. During their time on the Chitlin circuit, the Jacksons also performed at another important venue in the circuit, the Regal Theater. Gladys Knight, another star of the black scene, was also there that night. She invited people from Motown Records to the performance. Berry Gordy, the label's president, wasn't supposed to be there, but he had heard rumors of the promising group, and after their performance for Motown representatives, he became interested in the Jackson 5. The Jacksons later opened for Bobby Taylor and the Vancouvers, and lead singer Bobby Taylor arranged for them to audition at the coveted Motown label, so impressed was he with their performance. The Jacksons had to abandon a television appearance to audition, which greatly surprised and upset Katherine Jackson. Nevertheless, on July 23, 1968, around 10 a.m., the Jacksons were already in the parking lot of the Motown offices in Detroit. Chapter 6. Motown Studios and a Big Contract. Motown Studios in Detroit looks more like a small private home, like those we imagine when we think of the American dream. 2 stories, a white facade, blue shutters and doors. Nothing about this house on West Grand Boulevard betrays the place where legendary albums and some of the greatest artists in the history of R&B, soul, and jazz were recorded. The founder of the famous studio was Berry Gordy Jr. He created the first label, Telma Records, in 1959, and then bought a private home, which he converted into a recording studio. Space was limited, so as the label grew and his income increased, Gordy bought neighboring houses on the same street and converted them into studios. Over the 7 years of the studio's operation, Gordy purchased 7 buildings adjacent to his first purchase. By 1966, Gordy had over 450 employees, and the label's revenue exceeded $20 million. The studio was famous not only for the artists who brought in money for Berry Gordy, but also for its unique sound, which became known as the Motown sound and became a household word in America. Initially, it was just another R&B label, but thanks to the combined efforts of artists such as The Miracles, Martha and the Vandellas, Marvin Gaye, Mary Wells, the Marvelettes, and the Contours, as well as producers such as Smokey Robinson, Mickey Stevenson, and Berry Gordy himself, Motown Records began to develop a distinct stylistic identity. In 1964, Eddie Holland and Lamont Dozier began producing the label's new artists, the Supremes, and it was thanks to this group that the label's sound became recognizable. What made the Motown sound distinctive? First and foremost, it blended classic genres of the time, like gospel and soul, with contemporary pop music. Simple lyrics and straightforward rhymes intertwined with complex melodies featuring constant chord changes. Furthermore, the distinctive drumming style, with its emphasis on 4-note, is undeniable. The background vocals on studio recordings often sounded like gospel, even though the song might have a very popular tune. Furthermore, the studio's lead vocalists also always blended gospel with other styles in their technique. It's important to note, however, that similarities in recording techniques didn't make all Motown albums and songs identical. Motown music simply had a refined style born from the musical wisdom of the studio's staff. They didn't add four notes to a drum part because everyone else was playing it differently. They did it because it felt right to them. When this proved true for millions of record buyers, it merely confirmed their personal judgment rather than determined it, from John Landau's 1971 Rolling Stone article. According to former Motown artists and staff, the studio was always bustling with activity. There were always groups and solo artists honing their craft. Everyone there felt like close friends, or even more, like family. After the studio staff, particularly executive producers Ralph Seltzer and Suzanne DePass, listened to a few songs performed by the Jacksons, they simply responded with a short, "We'll get back to you in a couple of days." Berry Gordy personally made all decisions regarding new artist contracts, so they had to contact him, show him a video of the Jacksons taken at the studio, and get his verdict. The Jacksons, of course, weren't happy with this arrangement. They wanted an answer right away. But with nowhere else to go, the Jacksons stayed at a nearby hotel and waited for the call. Berry Gordy was very hesitant about working with children, having had negative experiences before. He'd been harassed by social services for using underage labor, and it was impossible to work with children as much as with adults. But he was also so captivated by the talented young vocalist of the Jackson 5 that Motown was ready to sign the group within a couple of days of their audition. The producers offered the Jacksons a standard 7-year contract. Joseph wasn't happy with this arrangement. He believed that even 5 years was too long, and the group couldn't risk falling into such a bind. Ultimately, after a few calls to Berry Gordy in Los Angeles, Joseph managed to secure a contract of only 1 year, unprecedented for the studio. The Jacksons signed it without even reading it. Neither I nor my sons read the agreement because all such contracts were based on the principle of take it or leave it. Since the boys were just starting out in the industry, we signed the contract, believing Ralph Seltzer's word that the terms were good. Joseph Jackson at his trial against Motown, 1975. Naturally, the lack of attention when signing the coveted contract would come back to haunt the Jacksons. Motown had been the target of much criticism from its own artists, almost from its inception. The contract terms were simply appalling, and the studio exploited the artists' labor to the maximum while paying them virtually nothing. For example, every studio contract, regardless of the length, contained a clause prohibiting the artist from recording music for any other label for 5 years after the end of their contract with Motown. Thus, even though the Jacksons had secured a minimum term deal, they were still locked in and immobilized for another 5 years afterward. Furthermore, the studio's artists were obligated to record whatever management demanded of them until they were satisfied with the result. Artists were paid for completed recordings, but completed in the studio's understanding meant released. And the decision to release recordings, as you might guess, depended entirely on management. Therefore, if a band spent several days in the studio recording 100 songs, but only 3 were ultimately released, the band was paid only for those 3 songs. The rest of the musicians' labor was simply unpaid and wasted. The label agreed to cover the costs of recording, arranging, dubbing, and releasing the albums, but the band was to recoup these costs with a percentage of the sales of the released material. Thus, the group's expenses were many times greater than its income, which in turn led to the debt trap into which the Jacksons later found themselves. As a final blow to normal working conditions, one clause in the contract stipulated that the rights to the group name the Jackson 5 and the Jackson 5 would also remain with Motown, so the Jacksons had no chance of retaining their name after their employment with the label. But one way or another, the contract was signed. Berry Gordy asked the Jacksons to move to Los Angeles to record in the label's new facilities, and a new chapter in the life of the impoverished large family from Gary began. Chapter 7. The Jackson 5 and the Life of Stars. The trip to California was a happy time. Joseph promised that one day we would go to California. Then I told him, the promise came true, but it wasn't you who kept it, it was the kids. Katherine Jackson in the documentary Michael Jackson, The Life of an Icon, 2011. One of the Jacksons' first performances in California was a small concert at Berry Gordy's estate for Diana Ross's birthday party. All the stars of his label gathered at the iconic label's home, and the Jacksons sang their songs on stage. Gordy's home had a small theater. Gordy introduced the Jacksons to Diana, marking the first meeting between young Michael and his future mentor. She also promised to help the boys on their creative paths in the industry, to which Joseph Jackson responded with a quiet and reserved, "We really appreciate it." After this, so to speak, initiation into the ranks of Motown Records, the Jacksons set about recording new material. According to Michael's recollections, there was once again no time for a snack after school or for lessons. Sometimes Michael would come to the studio with his brothers and watch the children playing on the neighboring lawns, trying to imagine what such childish freedom must have been like. The Jacksons never had such luxury, especially Michael, who found himself caught in this endless stream of work that lasted 5 years. If we were making an album, we'd come to the studio after school, sometimes with time for a snack, sometimes not. Often there simply wasn't enough time. I'd come home exhausted, it was already 11 or 12, and it was time for bed, Michael Jackson wrote in his memoir, Moonwalk. Nevertheless, the hard work was still yielding no results, and Berry Gordy was dissatisfied with the songs he'd recorded. There was no hit among them, and the Jacksons themselves, in the label's opinion, weren't ready for the big stage or television. The Jackson family, meanwhile, was thrilled with life in Hollywood, surrounded by palm trees, sunshine, and celebrities at every turn. Berry Gordy gathered them all to discuss promotional strategies at Diana Ross's home. It was there, at one of these meetings, that the legend was born that Diana discovered the Jacksons and introduced them to Motown. For shock value, it was decided to change Michael's age. He was now publicly identified as 8 years old, not 10. At this point, Michael learned an important lesson that he would follow throughout his career, something we will emphasize in this book. Everything said about his public image is not a lie, but a public relations stunt. That same year, 1969, Diana arranged a major concert for the Jacksons, their first public appearance in Hollywood. She then introduced the group as Michael Jackson and the Jackson 5. After this concert, there was only one thing left to do: release the group's first hit. Berry Gordy chose I Want to Be Free, a composition that had been worked on by Dick Richards, Freddie Perrin, and Phonce Mizell. The song was originally intended for Gladys Knight and the Pips, but Gordy clearly heard the Jacksons in it. Recording the song proved challenging. The Jacksons weren't very studio savvy, and the producers also noted their poor phonetic skills. They literally had to teach the Jacksons how to pronounce the words correctly. The final recording session lasted all day until 2 in the morning. During the recording process, the lyrics changed significantly, and I Want to Be Free eventually became I Want You Back. The song was released on October 7, 1969. After that, the group needed a promotional strategy, and Motown, of course, handled it. The label had little experience promoting children. Their only successful project was Stevie Wonder, so they had a tough time with the Jacksons. The brothers had to be diligent, sweet kids, role models. In every interview, every meeting with fans, their main goal was to be as modest, well-mannered, and tactful as possible. Fortunately for the Jacksons, this came easily thanks to the influence of their mother, Katherine. The label wanted the public to love the Jacksons not for their songs, but for who the brothers were. People were supposed to fall in love with their characters, and that's exactly what happened. In January 1970, the song topped the American charts. The Billboard Hot 100 is traditionally considered the most important chart in America. The hit parade was first published by a music and entertainment publication, and in 1913 it was called Last Week's 10 Bestsellers Among the Popular Songs. In 1955, the chart took on its now familiar form of listing the top 100 best-selling and most played songs of the week. Since then, the chart has been updated weekly by the publication to this day. The publication assigns each song a score based on sales and radio airplay. Sales carry more weight than radio airplay. Today, online sales and streaming services have been added to CD, vinyl, and cassette sales. The latter carries less weight than physical sales. To promote their first songs in 1970, the Jacksons appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show. It was also there that Elvis Presley, the Beatles, and the Family Stone made their television debuts. The 70s were a time of a veritable drug epidemic, and rock stars were susceptible to these substances. The music industry experienced so many overdose deaths during those years that many worried about the safety of the young Jacksons themselves. Ed Sullivan was among these people. In his memoirs, Michael recalled the words a TV host told him backstage before filming. "Never forget where your talent came from. Never forget that your talent is a gift from God." Michael remembered the host's kindness, so their first television appearance can be considered a successful and enjoyable start to the Jacksons' great fame. By Motown's decision, which they didn't even inform Joseph, they were now known as the Jackson 5 with a number instead of a word. The Jacksons spent all of 1970 working. Their next 3 singles, released by Motown, reached #1 on the American charts. In March, the song ABC, written using the same chords as the previous album, was released, followed by The Love You Save in June, and finally, in the fall, I'll Be There. Naturally, the singles were included on albums. The group's first single appeared on the album Diana Ross Presents the Jackson 5, the second and third on the album titled ABC, and the fourth on the album succinctly titled The Third Album. In parallel with releasing music, Motown continued to coach the Jacksons on public demeanor. Michael recalls that the brothers were given literacy lessons, endlessly tested on typical interview questions, and taught how to answer them correctly, and simultaneously instructed in etiquette and manners. A woman named Susan DePass also worked with them as a manager at the time. Michael recalled that she had a tremendous influence on the group's development and the development of their distinctive style. Susan not only spent almost all her time with the Jacksons, sleeping with them, and dining with them, but also helped them choose their clothes and hairstyles. It was at her suggestion that the Jacksons decided to get an afro. Soon after the band's breakthrough, the brothers began to face competition. Bands, many of which had to significantly change their styles to match the Jacksons, tried to emulate the success of the Gary Five-piece. Michael always considered this competition with the Partridge Family, the Osmonds, and the DeFranco family fair and healthy. Of course, none of the above ever achieved the level of success of the Jackson 5. For example, Right On, a popular magazine among African American teenagers, regularly published articles about the group, and at least one of its members appeared on the cover of every issue from 1972 to 1974. Motown and Berry Gordy were perfectly happy with the group's success. They needed it not only for the money, but also to prove to themselves and other artists that their method could still produce the desired results. The fact is that in the early 1970s, a new approach to writing and releasing music began to emerge in the music industry. Artists wanted publishing rights and an active role in writing lyrics, melodies, and arrangements. Motown, however, in keeping with traditions dating back to the 1950s, preferred to simply provide artists with material written by in-house studio staff. This system was successful, but it was beginning to become outdated. Times have changed, and so have artists. Stevie Wonder and Marvin Gaye insistently demanded more freedom and autonomy in songwriting from the studio. Of course, this wasn't just about creativity, but also about money. Producers and composers received much higher royalties than performers, so it was more profitable for artists to write their own music rather than hand over a portion of their income to Motown employees. So the success of a group working under the old standards helped the studio exert pressure on the artists through their authority and their desire for success, which often trumped their desire for profit. The Jacksons complied with the studio's demands perfectly and didn't demand any creative freedom. But this didn't last long. Chapter 8. Michael and Diana. When I learned Diana was getting married, I was happy for her because I knew it would make her happy. But it was also hard because I had to pretend to be shocked that she was marrying a man I'd never met. I was happy for her, but I must admit, I was hurt. And I was jealous, because I have always loved and will always love Diana. Michael Jackson in his book, Moonwalk. The relationship between Michael Jackson and Diana Ross raises many questions and controversy to this day. Some call Diana a second mother to Michael and the woman who helped him cope with fame and success more than anyone else, while others, on the contrary, consider her a molester who entered into an inappropriate relationship with Michael when he was barely 11. Michael moved in with Diana at the behest of Motown in late 1969. She became his full-fledged mentor, his tutor. According to various accounts, Michael lived in Diana's house for anywhere from 4 weeks to a year. During this time, he learned the ropes of PR by observing Ross's behavior and her team's career decisions. She herself was just preparing to leave the Supremes, the group that had brought her fame. He also often watched Diana rehearse in front of a mirror and mimicked her movements when she wasn't looking. Diana had a busy schedule, so she couldn't spend much time with Michael, but he says they still drew and visited museums together. Diana was a responsible person. Despite Michael's mother's concerns, her daily routine was strictly planned and organized. She went to bed early and rose early. This helped Michael learn the importance of discipline. His energy and mine were practically identical. He was a little boy who worked hard and loved performing in front of people. By that time, I was already quite famous, and, as with my time with the Supremes, Michael became the center of the group because he was so irresistible, Diana Ross said about Michael Jackson in an interview about working together on the film The Wiz. Just as Diana admired Michael's talent, Michael himself admired Diana. However, there can be no romance between Jackson and Ross. At the time Michael was staying with Diana, she was dating Berry Gordy, the founder of Motown. Their relationship was no secret. They didn't hide it and weren't particularly embarrassed about it in front of Michael. Rumor has it that their relationship was passionate and complicated. Allegedly, Diana and Berry often fought and broke up, so Ross hardly cared about little Michael. Of course, after Michael left Diana, they didn't even have time to visit each other. Nevertheless, they would maintain a warm relationship and remain close friends until Michael's death, with Diana actively supporting him at every stage of the king of pop's difficult life. Chapter 9. A cartoon series for the brothers and an estate for her parents. By 1971, the Jacksons had become full-fledged stars, especially by the standards of Black Americans. They spent most of their time on tour, and in January, they even managed to return to their hometown of Gary for 2 concerts. This event was undoubtedly significant for the Jacksons, so they teamed up with Motown to give it a special dimension. Arriving in Gary by helicopter, they landed in the parking lot of West Side High School in front of hundreds, if not thousands, of spectators. The concerts, of course, were sold out, including those children who, just 2 years earlier, had laughed at the Jacksons rehearsing at home. The group's other concerts were no less spectacular. Crowds of fans regularly broke down barriers and climbed onto the stage, literally going wild. At one point, the Jacksons even had to flee the stage and scramble into a limousine to avoid being mauled by the crowd. They didn't finish the last song on the set list. Riding the wave of the Jackson 5's popularity, other companies naturally took an interest. That same year, ABC decided to launch an animated series featuring the Jacksons. The show, called Jackson 5, aired weekly in the mornings as part of the Saturday morning cartoon segment, a tradition on American television at the time. A similar segment existed on the 3 major networks in the country, NBC, CBS, and ABC. The animated series, of course, centered on the group itself. In the first episode, viewers witnessed the beginning of their career, with Diana Ross once again portrayed as their mentor and the person who first spotted the promising young men. Each subsequent episode depicted the various challenges and difficulties the Jacksons faced at work. The brothers themselves played virtually no role in the production. Their voices were only heard in musical numbers, while the dialogue was voiced by young African-American actors. The animated series premiered on September 11, 1971, with 17 episodes in the first season and 6 in the second. The series ran for a total of 2 years before being canceled by ABC. I loved being a cartoon character. It was so much fun waking up on Saturdays to watch cartoons and see ourselves on screen. It was like a fantasy come true, Michael Jackson said of the Jackson 5 cartoon. At the height of the group's popularity, the Jackson parents decided to buy a new home. On May 5, 1971, the Jacksons moved into a massive mansion at 4641 Havenhurst Street in Encino, California. The Jackson seniors still own and live in the house. Of course, Berry Gordy helped the Jackson seniors with such a major purchase. He convinced Joseph that they urgently needed to write off as much of the property taxes as possible to reduce their payments. He wanted to loan the Jacksons money for a down payment, but Joseph wanted the house to be fully owned by the family, so he took out a $100,000 loan himself. Befitting the family's new status, the estate resembled a royal palace. Brick bay windows, towers with pointed roofs soaring into the sky, several terraces, tall stained glass windows in the tower housing the spiral staircase, a wide driveway, and a fountain in front of the main entrance. It's hard to imagine how the family felt when they found themselves in a house of this size after living in a small, ugly house in Gary, where they had to warm themselves by the stove in winter. A new chapter in the Jacksons' lives had truly begun. Unfortunately, it wouldn't last long, giving way to a completely new stage that would once again shake the family's peace. Chapter 10. Stagnation in the group and Michael's first solo work. They wanted me to sing a certain way, and I just knew it wasn't right. No matter how old you are, if you know what's best, people should listen to you. Michael Jackson. Michael first asked Motown producers to improvise and sing the way he wanted to in 1972 while recording "Lookin' Through the Windows." He felt that the version the studio staff had proposed was too mechanical and lifeless. To persuade the studio to experiment, young Michael had to call Berry Gordy himself and clarify the situation. It's hard to say what exactly made Gordy agree, given his views on Motown principles, but he gave in to the artist, probably for the first time in his life. Of course, the artist with whom this happened had to be Michael. It couldn't have happened any other way. From that point on, Michael added verses, background vocals, and experimental vocals to every song the group recorded. Shortly before, in 1971, Joseph learned that the Jacksons' main rivals, the Osmond brothers, had released a solo song by one of their members, which led to the rise of singer Donny Osmond. Joseph was spurred on by their competitors' commercial ploy and decided he and the Jackson 5 needed the same. By then, the group had already begun to experience a decline in sales, although it wasn't yet critical, at least according to Berry Gordy. Their single Mama's Pearl reached number 2 on the Billboard 100 chart, and the follow-up, Never Can Say Goodbye, would only reach number 2 a month after its release, completely failing in the UK, an important and one of the largest music markets. Motown had a song in store that was planned for the Jacksons, but at the last minute, Berry Gordy and Joseph Jackson decided to release it as a solo single for Michael. Of course, no one was betting big on it. The studio was more interested in testing Michael's potential as a solo artist. Thus, Michael Jackson's first solo song was the lyrical "Got to Be There." The song became a major hit in the UK and was well received by American audiences. The single was followed by a full-length album by Michael, also titled "Got to Be There." At the time, the band was touring, and Michael began to try to incorporate more and more ideas into the creative process. One day, he says, he asked to leave the stage before his first hit solo number so he could wear the hat he wore on the album cover. He was sure the fans would appreciate the reference. Everyone thought the idea absurd. There was no time for it in the show, and besides, why would he need a hat anyway? That same year, Donny Osmond and Marvin Gaye began performing on stage wearing similar hats. Today, we all understand that this play on self-referencing works very well and is loved by fans. For proof, just look at Taylor Swift's work strategy. Obviously, his solo release and popularity further separated Michael from normal life, his peers, and what Jackson himself called ordinary people. By that time, the boys had already been homeschooled. School was simply unsafe for them. Michael had the hardest time of it. Many noted that of all the Jacksons, he had more trouble socializing than the others. This is understandable, since all he'd seen since the age of 5 was the music industry and work, work, work. Furthermore, even his relationships with his brothers began to change. The boys were growing up, some were already fully fledged men, and they had other interests. No one cared about Michael. The situation worsened when the brothers began marrying and starting families, like Tito, who married in June '72, or Jermaine, who married Berry Gordy's daughter Hazel in November '73. When I go on stage, I become a different person. It happens to a lot of artists, even comedians. People think they're funny 24/7, but they're not. We're all like that, shy in real life. I can't sing and dance in front of just one person. If it's a 30,000-seater auditorium, everything comes easy to me. I don't know why. From an interview with Michael Jackson. Joseph was deeply troubled by the group's failures, while Motown seemed oblivious to the problems. Berry Gordy was busy with other artists and projects by then, particularly spending much of his time filming Lady Sings the Blues, starring Diana Ross, and the other employees were indifferent to the Jackson 5's waning success. The lack of interest in promoting the group could be explained by the fact that by that point, the Jacksons already had everything they could imagine: a string of hits, a legion of fans, and an ABC cartoon series. In 1973, the group released several new recordings: the live album In Japan, recorded, as you might guess, in Japan, and a new album, Skywriter. The latter became the worst-selling of the Jacksons' career. The songs on Skywriter were ambitious pop records with complex string arrangements, but they weren't for us. Of course, we didn't want to sing ABC for the rest of our lives. That was the last thing we wanted, but even our old fans felt ABC had more life in it. It was hard to swallow, Michael Jackson said of Skywriter. After their meteoric rise in popularity, an equally rapid decline began, naturally accompanied by Joseph's anger, who actively blamed Motown for their failures, believing that they had done absolutely nothing to promote the group. Joseph also didn't like the direction the Jacksons were heading. He, like all the brothers, understood that they needed more control over their music, more experimentation, but unlike Stevie Wonder, the studio didn't grant them such privileges as creative control, as we've already established. The picture was slightly diluted by another 1973 release, the album Get It Together. The title track of this album sold well, signaling that not all was lost and that people still wanted to listen to the Jacksons. Their sound had also changed slightly. By this point, Michael was recording parts separately from his brothers, and the studio had outsourced some of the backing vocals to outside singers who weren't even credited in the album or song descriptions. And although Michael disliked working separately from his family, audiences obviously liked the new sound. Musically, it no longer seemed so naive and sweet. It felt like the brothers had grown up and become young adults. Meanwhile, Michael's solo work was not idle. He recorded the soundtrack, a song written specifically for the film Ben. Nothing thrilled me more than working on the song for that film. I had an incredible time. When the film came out, I'd go to the theater and wait for the end credits to say Ben, performed by Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson said about working on the soundtrack for Ben. The song became a major success for Michael, winning the prestigious Golden Globe Award, second only to the Oscar, for Best Original Song, and was also nominated for Best Original Song at the Academy Awards, also known as the Oscars. However, the song lost. On the other hand, many critics from reputable publications, such as Vince Aletti of Rolling Stone, disliked the song and the album. Aletti gave Michael's album only 2 stars out of 5. Ben, whose cover Michael awkwardly shares with a monstrous rat, contains a lot of original material, and while it doesn't have anything as musically intense as Got to Be There or I Want to Be Where You Are, overall it's a stronger album than the first. The title track is undoubtedly beautiful, and Michael delivers it with a surprising amount of feeling, but it's still a bit too superficial for my tastes, music critic Vince Aletti wrote for Rolling Stone, December 7, 1972. One can imagine how upset Michael, who had so much fun recording this album, might have been if he'd read such a review. Whether he knew about it or not remains a mystery. But then, in 1973, Michael had the opportunity to perform at the Oscars, and it was the first time he'd performed on such a big stage without his brothers. Perhaps it was at that moment, surrounded by famous actors and film industry workers, that he became infected with the idea of getting into cinema, and very soon this idea would come to life. Chapter 11. Catherine and Joseph's Divorce. Looking back on the Jackson family today, it's clear they were never a perfect family. The parents raised their children as best they could, and their relationships were on and off. Joseph, as we've already established, had been unfaithful to Catherine back when they were traveling to talent shows, and this situation hasn't changed over the years. Only now, rumor has it, he was having affairs with his son's young fans, which seems even more vile than simple infidelity and trips to strip clubs. Catherine knew about her husband's infidelities, as did the children, so conflict seemed only a matter of time. However, for a long time, she allowed Joseph more than she should have. In 1973, she finally decided to file for divorce. We can't say for sure what was the final straw for Catherine, but a few months later, in 1974, a woman named Cheryl Terrell gave birth to a daughter with Joseph. The girl was named Giovanni Jackson. Perhaps the news of her husband's mistress's pregnancy was the trigger that drove Catherine to extreme measures. They nearly reached the point of divorce, which frankly delighted their children, but unfortunately for them, the couple reconciled. Catherine withdrew the divorce petition from the court, and peace returned to the family. According to one of Michael Jackson's most renowned biographers, John Randall Taraborelli, Catherine was dissuaded from divorce by virtually the entire Motown team. They were concerned about the image of the group and the entire Jackson family. They were supposed to be picture-perfect role models. Their parents' divorce didn't fit that picture at all. Fortunately, the tabloids, we'll talk about their heyday later, weren't so aggressive back then and didn't have the ability to quickly gather information, so rumors about the elder Jackson's divorce didn't really make it into the headlines of American newspapers. However, nearly 10 years later, in 1982, when the group was no longer with Motown, Catherine again attempted to divorce Joseph, and again it was unsuccessful. Michael's mother again withdrew the papers, and the couple reconciled. That year, Catherine even threatened one of her husband's mistresses and, according to one account, beat her. After this incident and the second divorce attempt, the couple remained together until Joseph's death. Chapter 12. A series of failures and the departure from Motown. On April 7, 1974, the Jacksons traveled to Las Vegas for a series of performances at one of the city's most expensive and prestigious hotels, the MGM Grand. Their premiere show, like all subsequent ones, was a success and received a standing ovation from the audience. This was a major victory for the Jackson family as they were performing for the first time in front of wealthy white Americans. As we've established previously, music in those years was still divided into black and white. The 1970s saw the fusion of genres only just beginning, so for black artists, gaining recognition from white audiences meant only one thing: entry into Hollywood's mainstream, a significant sales boost, and a guaranteed new career arc. The Jacksons achieved this, but this time, not thanks to Motown, but in spite of it. At that time, Las Vegas was just beginning to become a golden cage for artists, and performing there was considered more of a prestigious and significant achievement than a sign of a career's decline. Yet Motown executives, led by Gordy, were opposed. They believed the Jacksons weren't ready for such a large-scale concert, especially for a sophisticated white audience. Joseph Jackson, however, was determined. He had long been concerned about the label's approach to promoting the group and the way they recorded their music. He decided to take the children to Vegas himself and pay for all the expenses. Berry Gordy repeatedly tried to dissuade Joseph, but he was adamant. The conflict was further complicated by the fact that Berry and Joseph were now related, as Jermaine Jackson was married to Hazel Gordy, so Berry assured Joseph he was trying to protect his son-in-law from failure. In a sense, Berry did become more caring about the Jacksons after his daughter's wedding. According to Michael, the single Get It Together received as much attention as their earlier works and, as a result, sold well. However, it still wasn't the level of promotion and success Joseph envisioned for the group. The Jackson 5's albums weren't selling. They were outdated. The only exception was Dancing Machine, also from 1974, which attempted to flirt with disco, but that didn't improve the situation. Classic R&B was just fading into the past, ushering in the era of electronic dance music, and Motown allowed the Jacksons to create an album in a new style, or rather, they created it for them. We wanted to write, we wanted to make our own music, but our contract with Motown simply wouldn't allow us to do that, Marlon Jackson said in the 2016 documentary Michael Jackson's Journey from Motown to Off the Wall. The album's title track reached number 2 on the Billboard 100, a familiar position for the band, but flopped completely in Europe, as did the rest of the album. The studio didn't give the Jacksons any more material. They hadn't released anything else in 1974, which angered Joseph. That's when the idea for Vegas came about. After the success of the Motown concert series, as often happened, a press release was sent out to all the relevant publications without consulting them, praising the Jacksons for the good and high-quality work they had done together with the label. Now, the success of the Vegas show officially belonged to Motown, not Joseph and his family. In 1975, the label greenlit another Michael Jackson solo album, Forever Michael, but it flopped on the charts, and Joseph's conflict with Motown reached a heated stage. Joseph understood that the brothers had no future at Motown, and that meant they had to move on. All the brothers agreed, all except Michael. He hesitated because he still considered Berry Gordy a good man to whom he owed a lot. Michael even met with Berry privately to complain about the group's situation, but it didn't help. Joseph, Jackie, Tito, Marlon, and Michael ultimately voted unanimously to leave Motown during a private conversation at home. The only person not included in this conversation was Jermaine, Hazel Gordy's husband. He was excluded from this conversation for obvious reasons of bias. The brothers' mistrust of him would only grow later, which would become another nail in the coffin of the close-knit family. Joseph and his lawyer, Richard Aarons, immediately began searching for a new label to sign with. Fortunately for the Jacksons, their deal with Motown was just ending, and they were in no rush to sign a new one. Atlantic Records was the first to cross the Jacksons' path, but a meeting with the label's representatives revealed that they weren't thrilled with the Jacksons, particularly due to the sharp decline in their album sales. Right after Atlantic, CBS, or more precisely, their subsidiary Epic Records, signed the Jackson 5. The group wanted to leave Motown. Joseph believed he could take these guys to a whole other level that Motown just couldn't reach, said Steve Popovich, then vice president of A&R at Epic Records, in the 2016 documentary Michael Jackson's Journey from Motown to Off the Wall. They told me not to sign. They told me their band was just cartoons. So I went to the boss, Walter Yetnikoff, and I said, "The Jacksons belong on this label. We call ourselves a music family, and they are a family. I want to sign them." Ron Alexenberg, then general manager of Epic Records, in the 2016 documentary Michael Jackson's Journey from Motown to Off the Wall. Chapter 13. A New Beginning and Working on the Wiz. Joseph and Epic Records management shared one common bond: their belief in the Jackson brothers' untapped potential. This belief helped them reach an agreement allowing the brothers to decide what music they wanted to release. Their new contract stipulated that the brothers would be able to choose 3 songs for each album, either written by themselves or suggested by other producers. The rest of the songs would remain the label's. Nevertheless, this was a major step forward. Motown wouldn't even give them that. The Epic contract was signed 8 months before the Motown deal expired, which, of course, led to legal trouble. Motown sued the Jacksons, demanding $5 million in damages. Joseph Jackson, in his usual rebellious manner, countersued, claiming the label owed the Jacksons unpaid royalties and uncovered expenses. In fact, it was the Jacksons who owed the money. As we recall, Joseph hadn't read the Motown contract, meaning he had no idea the group was required to cover the costs of all recorded songs, including unreleased ones. The Jackson 5 recorded 469 songs, of which only 174 were released. So, during their time with Motown, the Jacksons owed Berry Gordy over $500,000. On June 17, 1975, at a press conference hosted by CBS and Joseph Jackson, the Jacksons' move to a new label following the expiration of their contracts with Motown was officially announced. Michael was 16 years old at the time. He would turn 17 in 6 weeks. Later, Berry Gordy would add several $1 million to his lawsuit against the Jacksons for using the group's name and photos of the old lineup in official media statements about the group's move to another label and in CBS promotional materials. The outcome of the Jackson-Motown standoff was a $2 million settlement from Joseph to the studio. Furthermore, the name The Jackson 5, along with all its variations, remained in the studio's possession. The Jacksons lost the name they had once used to sign with Motown. To be fair, there was no longer a Jackson 5 at that point. Jermaine remained loyal to his father-in-law, Berry Gordy, and remained at the studio, refusing to sign a new contract with his brothers. That was the end of the Jackson-Motown story, but years later Michael would rekindle his warm relationship with Berry Gordy and continue to call him a second father. We're friends again, and he's like a father to me, very proud of me and happy for my success. No matter what, I will always love Berry Gordy because he taught me some of the most important things in life. Michael Jackson on Motown executive Berry Gordy. The deal with CBS gave the Jacksons not only greater creative freedom than before, but also a $750,000 advance and an additional $500,000 for recording. The lineup also changed after Jermaine's departure, with a young Marlon taking his place. The group's name was now simply the Jacksons. I distinctly remember our first show without him because it was painful for me. From the very first days on stage, and even during our rehearsals in the living room of our house in Gary, Jermaine stood to my left with his bass. It was vital for me to stand next to him, Michael Jackson said of Jermaine's departure from the group. Before the release of their first album at the new studio, the Jacksons were forced to star in their own late-night comedy show, which aired on CBS. Michael hated the show, which he admitted to repeatedly, but it brought in decent ratings and clearly benefited the band's image, bringing them closer to their fans. Despite Michael's dislike of television, he was still drawn to film. In 1977, when Michael was just 19, he decided to audition for the film The Wiz. The film was an adaptation of the famous Broadway play, a new take on Frank Baum's classic story, The Wizard of Oz, not to be confused with the production of Wicked, which was adapted for a film starring Ariana Grande and Cynthia Erivo and released in 2024. It serves as a prequel to Baum's original work. The Broadway show was aimed at a black audience. Michael's involvement with The Wiz could have been hampered by the fact that the same Motown people were still working on the adaptation. However, Berry Gordy and Michael's close friend Diana Ross, who was also slated to star in the film, assured him that no one would stand in the way of his casting, despite the studio's conflict with the Jacksons. Michael had clearly defined the role he wanted to play in the film. He wanted to be the Scarecrow. Michael felt this character was the perfect fit for him. He auditioned for this very role. I was so happy. I saw the play about 6 times. I talked to Diane on the phone and kept asking, "Oh, so you're going to be in The Wiz next month?" And then I found out they cast me too. They asked if I wanted to be in it, and I said yes, Michael Jackson in an interview on the Molly Meldrum Show, November 2, 1977. I saw the original version of The Wizard of Oz, the one with Judy Garland, when I was little. I liked the Scarecrow the best, as all kids do, because we empathize with him more than anyone else. And I always looked up to him, even tried to imitate his walk when I was 6, walking around the house like that. Michael Jackson in an interview on Soul Train, February 3, 1979. Michael enjoyed acting in big films and learning new musical numbers, although he said he often irritated his co-stars by memorizing choreography too quickly. Ever since I was little, I could watch someone dance and immediately know how to imitate it, Michael Jackson wrote in his book Moonwalk. For Jackson, filming The Wiz was a profound experience in understanding film language and the workings of cinema. He enjoyed observing the process and learning, but what he found most entertaining was the makeup. He spent 5 hours a day, 6 days a week in the makeup chair, as the Scarecrow character required prosthetic makeup to be applied to his face. Michael believed his appearance was ugly at the time, so he enjoyed changing it on set. Later, Michael's body dysmorphia would lead to some rather unpleasant consequences. Filming on the film lasted from July 13, 1997 to December 29, 1997. The film was released on October 24, 1978, and was a commercial failure. With a budget of $24 million, it earned only $13 million. Many critics, in turn, disliked the film from the very beginning, claiming that Diana Ross was too old to play Dorothy. However, despite the film's box office failure, Michael still reaped practical benefits from the shoot, which caused his career to take a U-turn and paved the way for his rise to international fame. One day, all the film's leading actors and some of the crew gathered on set for a table read. One of Michael's lines included the name of the Greek philosopher Socrates, which he mispronounced the first time. Silence fell, and then a quiet voice from behind him whispered the correct pronunciation to Michael. When the embarrassed Michael turned around, he saw a familiar face, though he couldn't place it. "Quincy Jones, I'm doing the music for the film," the man said, extending his hand. Chapter 14. Studio 54 and Michael Jackson's Nightlife. While filming The Wiz and Michael's friendship with Quincy Jones, more on him later, was growing, Jackson discovered New York's nightlife. During this time, he became a frequent guest at the most scandalous venue of the era, Studio 54. In 1977, two college friends, Steve Rabel and Ian Schragle, bought an old theater building on 54th Street, which had once housed a CBS broadcast station, the Ritz Hotel, and even a casino. The area was considered seedy and deserted, in short, hardly the best location for a trendy nightclub. However, a clever advertising campaign, which drove the club's founders into debt, complex mechanical sets, and disco music, which was what the club promised to play, which was rapidly gaining momentum, did the trick. So many people showed up for the opening that they literally blocked the entire street. The security guards hired to work the club had to be posted at the entrance, otherwise the crowd would have simply destroyed it. Within a few weeks, Studio 54 became a mecca for A-listers who came there to dance, surprise people with unusual outfits, take illegal substances, and have sex. Of course, the light show and elaborate decorations, which changed for each party, occupied a special place. The club's regulars included Liza Minnelli, Cher, Elton John, Mick Jagger, David Bowie, Andy Warhol, and hundreds of other stars, who, due to strict face control, could be turned away from the club, just like regular patrons. Michael came to the club to unwind and dance. That was his main motivation. "I like the atmosphere at Studio 54. I've been to a lot of discos, and I've never liked any of them. Everything feels different here. I feel such elation when the sets come down, then the balcony. It's truly amazing. When you come here, you disappear from the real world. It's pure escapism. Usually, when we dance, it's choreographed. That happens every night. But here, you're free, you dance with whoever you want, and just have fun. Michael Jackson in an interview for The Today Show at Studio 54, February 11, 1978. Studio 54 gave Michael the sense of freedom he'd been missing all his life, but it also definitely changed the direction of his future solo albums. When he went to the club, he watched people and listened to the newest, craziest music imaginable in 1978. But of course, the greatest contribution to the sound of Michael's future music wasn't made by a nightclub, but by a man who had already managed to unlock Michael's potential on a film set. While recording backing tracks, Michael first used the short screams that would later become a hallmark of his vocals, and it was thanks to Quincy Jones that this happened. Chapter 15. Quincy Jones and the breakthrough album, Off the Wall. Quincy Jones began his career as a trumpeter in Dizzy Gillespie's band in 1956 and spent about a year with the group touring South America. He then received an excellent musical education in Paris and returned home to the United States, where, after several part-time jobs in bands, he landed a position at Mercury Records. Naturally, by 1978, Jones was best known for his work in film. He was first asked to write a film soundtrack in 1964 for Sidney Lumet's The Pawnbroker. After this, Quincy Jones moved from New York to Hollywood, where over the course of several years he wrote music for more than 10 films. Besides film scores in the mid-1960s, the composer worked with Frank Sinatra, Dinah Washington, Ella Fitzgerald, Sarah Vaughan, and Peggy Lee, whose album and single sales peaked during the period of his collaboration with Jones. In other words, meeting and befriending Jones was Michael's lucky break. In fact, Michael and Quincy Jones first met when Michael was 12. He and his brothers were just beginning their careers in Los Angeles when they were introduced by artist Sammy Davis Jr., who told them Michael had a bright future ahead of him. Jones and Jackson never crossed paths again until filming began on The Wiz. They became close, and by the end of filming, they were good friends. One day, Michael asked Jones if he knew anyone who could help him record a new solo album, to which Jones replied that he could contribute as well. Quincy would ultimately take on Michael's album entirely. By the time Jones and Jackson began communicating, things were going badly for the Jacksons. Their first album, recorded at CBS Studios in 1976, was a flop. The same fate befell the 1977 album Goin' Places. Its sales were disappointing, peaking at number 63 on the U.S. charts and dropping out of the UK charts entirely just a week after its release. Joseph and his brothers had to practically beg CBS executives, who were about to dump the band and end their deal, to record another album. They were then allowed complete control and to record their own songs. Destiny was released after Michael's filming of The Wiz and brought the band the crumbs of success they needed to stay afloat and avoid being dropped by the label. The song Shake Your Body, Down to the Ground sold 2 million copies, and Blame It on the Boogie became a decent hit. Furthermore, to promote the album, the Jacksons decided to hire new personal managers, and they really helped. Numerous articles, interviews, and press appearances by the Jackson brothers, where they talked about how happy they were to finally show off their creativity, did the trick. In reality, the brothers only wrote songs. They didn't know how to produce them. That was still the job of the studio. Michael didn't like lying in interviews, but there was no other way. They needed to sell the album and sell it well, and the younger Jackson understood this. When I first heard their album Destiny, I loved it. They were great. I was proud of them. Katherine Jackson said in the documentary, Michael Jackson, The Life of an Icon, 2011. With each new album on CBS, Michael increasingly realized that it was time for a change. He felt a strength and an overwhelming desire to write his own solo music. Perhaps Michael's decision to leave the group was also influenced by fatigue from the control and oppression of his father, who kept all his sons under his thumb. Joseph said to do this. Joseph wants you to do that. Joseph sends you there. Michael wanted freedom, and not just creatively. It was then that he began searching for a producer for his solo recording. Catherine and Joseph were against Michael leaving the band. Catherine saw it as a rejection of his family, while Joseph considered it a betrayal. The band was his family, which Michael intended to abandon at a difficult time when album sales, and therefore his earnings, were plummeting. Nevertheless, the decision was made, and Michael began working on his first solo album for CBS with Quincy Jones. For the first time in his life, Michael's ideas were treated with attention and respect, which undoubtedly allowed him to blossom and demonstrate his full potential. Quincy became a new father figure for Michael, the same one he had once sought in Berry Gordy, but this time, everything truly worked out. Quincy appreciated, loved, and respected Michael. They enjoyed working together. Quincy gave Michael complete freedom. All he had to do was ensure high-quality, clear sound. The result of their collaboration was the album Off the Wall, released on August 10, 1979. The title itself spoke for itself. Michael Jackson was now off the wall. The title perfectly suited the album, although Michael initially wanted to call it Girlfriend after one of the album's central songs. He wanted this album to sound unique and completely different from anything they had recorded as a group. During the group's tour for the album Destiny, Michael wrote a letter to himself in which he spoke about his desires and vision for his future career. The text was published as recently as 2016. My name will be MJ. There will be no more Michael Jackson. I want to become a completely new character, a completely new image. People shouldn't remember me as the boy who sang ABC or I Want You Back. I must become a new, amazing actor/singer/dancer who will shock the world. I won't give interviews. I will become magic. Of course, Michael succeeded in all of this. The album combined funk, pop, and melancholic R&B. For the first time, Michael sounded so vibrant and sexy, giving his all to each song. During the recording of She's Out of My Life, the singer couldn't hold back his tears during every take. Quincy Jones ultimately decided to leave the recording as is, so we can now hear Michael begin to cry in the song's final lines. The album brought Michael 2 hits, Don't Stop Till You Get Enough and Rock With You, which topped the U.S. Billboard 100. The other 2 singles from the album, Off the Wall and She's Out of My Life, reached the top 10. Thus, the album became the first in history to have 4 singles in the top 10 in America. The album cover, of course, deserves special attention. Michael stands leaning against a brick wall, dressed in a stylish black tuxedo. Bold, modern, and completely new, Michael smiles and looks directly into the camera. Against the backdrop of their band's outdated album covers, one can sense the new breath Michael needed to blossom. The cover, of course, was Michael's idea. The album not only made Michael Jackson a world-famous artist, selling millions of copies worldwide, but also allowed him to gain freedom. After his 21st birthday in August 1979, he hired his first personal lawyer, John Branca, who was able to change the terms of Jackson's deal with CBS. Now, Michael could leave the band at any time and record solo material without losing his contract with the label. The Jacksons, however, would still be in the studio. Joseph was furious at his son's free spirit. Rumor has it they even had a serious fight, but there was no turning back. Michael had become a global star, and a major solo career awaited him. Branca also negotiated a 37% royalty rate for Michael that was unique for the time. For comparison, only the legendary Bob Dylan had a similar deal at the time. But Michael was now a star on a whole new level, so CBS had no choice but to agree. Off the Wall received overwhelming critical acclaim and, what's more, won a Grammy Award for Best Male R&B Vocal Performance. Michael, of course, was disappointed that the album only won 1 award and wasn't even nominated for Album of the Year. But it was nonetheless a huge breakthrough for the entire Jackson family. Off the Wall represents Michael Jackson's first step toward becoming a seasoned showbiz figure. With the exception of a couple of controversial songs, it's an absolute success. The album presents Michael as the Stevie Wonder of the 80s. Music critic Stephen Holden wrote for Rolling Stone, November 1st, 1979. In retrospect, it becomes clear that it was after the release of this album that Michael never wavered from his own creative vision and remained outside the box throughout his career. Chapter 16. First Love and First Plastic Surgeries. Making Off the Wall was one of the most difficult periods of my life, despite the album's eventual success. I only had a couple of close friends at the time, and I felt isolated. I was so lonely that sometimes I'd just walk around the neighborhood waiting to meet someone I could talk to and become friends with, Michael Jackson wrote in his autobiography, Moonwalk. Michael Jackson's personal life has always been the subject of intense interest, although in practice there was little of interest. Michael simply didn't have the time or opportunity to make friends off-camera or date girls. Jackson himself admitted that, while he and his brothers were still attending public school, there were girls he was attracted to, but he was too shy and didn't know how to approach them, much less talk to them. Michael's first real romance didn't begin until he was 19. In 1977, Michael met young actress Tatum O'Neal on the famous Sunset Strip in Los Angeles. They were at the On the Rocks nightclub with their families. She was only 14 at the time, but she and Michael exchanged numbers. According to him, it was with her that he had his first date, sometime later, when they found themselves at a party hosted by Playboy founder Hugh Hefner. That was when Tatum first held Michael's hand, but the subsequent stories differ greatly. Michael claimed that he and Tatum had a genuine romance, which later naturally evolved into friendship. Tatum, however, said in an interview that Michael simply had a good imagination. Perhaps neither of them is lying, and for the inexperienced Michael, what was happening between him and Tatum was a romance, while the girl, even though she was younger than the singer, saw nothing romantic in their interactions. In any case, in his autobiography, Michael called Tatum his first true love after, of course, Diana Ross. My first girlfriend, whom I really loved, was Tatum O'Neal. But I think I just wasn't prepared for the things she said, Michael Jackson told journalist Martin Bashir in an interview, May 2002. After Tatum, model and actress Brooke Shields, known to many for her role in the legendary film The Blue Lagoon, entered Michael Jackson's life. They met in 1981 when Michael, like Brooke herself, had just entered the world of great fame. The film about two teenagers lost on a desert island had been released a year earlier. They attended several public events together. Michael insisted they had a passionate and brief affair, but Brooke, like Tatum, denied any romantic or, even more so, sexual connection. Nevertheless, both women considered Michael a good friend and remained devoted to him like sisters. Michael's insecurities manifested themselves not only in their relationships, but also in his everyday life. We've already established that Michael considered his appearance ugly, but he always paid particular attention to his nose. All the Jackson brothers had large noses. It was practically their defining feature, and as Michael's friend, actress Jane Fonda noted, Michael wanted to change his nose not so much to become beautiful as to be less like Joseph, the father who had bossed him around, forced him to work, and beat him. His brothers added fuel to the fire. As children, they teased Michael about his big nose, even though they themselves had similar noses. Michael had long considered rhinoplasty, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. A chance fall during a pre-tour rehearsal with his brothers in the spring of 1979 came to the rescue, so to speak. At the time, Michael hadn't yet released a solo album. Due to an injury, Michael had a broken septum. He had to undergo surgery, which left his nose slightly narrower. This is how we see it, in particular on the cover of the album Off the Wall. However, soon after the surgery, Michael experienced some difficulty breathing and singing, which led him back to the office of surgeon Stephen Hoofland, who would later perform all of Michael's other plastic surgeries. Chapter 17. Thriller and Triumph. I believe in dreams and in making them come true, I really do. Every time I watch the sunset, I make a wish just before the sun goes down and disappears. Michael Jackson in Moonwalk. After the release of Off the Wall, his family persuaded Michael to return to the studio to record another album with his brothers. Triumph was released in 1981 and was a success, but whether this was due to Michael's popularity or the excellent quality of the material is difficult to say. Regardless, thanks to strong sales, the label insisted on a large-scale tour, which ultimately ran from July 9, 1981 to September 26, 1981. The final 2 shows were held at the Forum in Los Angeles. Naturally, every show on the tour was sold out. Michael didn't like the idea of touring with his brothers. They had long since drifted apart and weren't the family they'd once pretended to be. Besides, Michael had plans for his own career, and preparing for a complex show didn't allow him to pursue them. The only thing that truly captivated Michael during the tour preparations was his interactions with magician Doug Henning. In his book, Michael mentioned how fascinating his conversations with Doug were and how many secrets of the craft he'd discovered. Michael felt guilty, unable to share such valuable and useful knowledge with Doug. Thanks to the work of his brothers and Doug Henning, the tour was fantastic. The show featured songs from the band's new album and their hits, as well as tracks from Off the Wall. Moreover, due to the success of Michael's work, these were given special emphasis. For example, after performing the hit Don't Stop Till You Get Enough, Michael would vanish into smoke, delighting the audience every time. After the tour ended, Michael was determined to start recording a new album, and this time the stakes were higher than ever. He wanted to make the album more successful than Off the Wall, which seemed practically impossible at the time. However, along with his determined desire to make a new record and develop his career, came uncertainty and confusion, which was noticed primarily by Michael's brothers. Perhaps it was precisely to escape the uncertainty and difficulties of life that Michael began to act more and more like a child. He bought toys and enjoyed spending time with young fans, who often crowded outside the gates of their family estate. However, at the time, few people paid attention to Michael's escapism. Together with Quincy Jones, they selected 9 songs to be included on the album. Production proceeded smoothly, but difficulties arose during the mixing and mastering stages. Neither Michael nor Quincy were satisfied with the result. In fact, they were horrified by the way the songs sounded. The mixing process had to be restarted. For Michael, the recording period was exhausting and emotionally difficult. He needed a perfect result. While working in the studio, Michael once mentioned his expectation of selling 100 million copies. He wanted the album to become the best-selling in history. Quincy Jones and Michael's lawyer, John Branca, laughed nervously, telling the artist that he shouldn't expect the same success as before. That day, Michael ran out of the studio in tears, so weighed down by the thought of possible failure. That year, the music industry was indeed in decline. Listeners were buying significantly fewer records, leading to a stagnation in the market. Not the best conditions for releasing a best-selling album. However, as it turned out, the industry simply needed a jolt, and Michael Jackson and his 6th studio album Thriller provided it. Thriller is a remarkable pop record, the final statement for today from one of the greatest singers in popular music today. But it's also something more. It's a sign, more hopeful than anything we've ever seen, that the destructive barriers that regularly appear between black and white music, between white and black culture, can be broken down again, journalist John Rockwell wrote for the New York Times, December 19, 1982. Instead of rekindling the simple funk of Off the Wall, Jackson has given us a piquant record whose up-tempo rhythms do nothing to obscure its heartbreaking dark messages. Jackson's new demeanor gives the album a deeper, if less visceral, edge than any of his previous work, marking another creative turning point for this prodigiously talented performer, music critic Christopher Connolly wrote for Rolling Stone, January 28, 1983. A star of records, radio, and rock videos, a one-man team to save the music business, a songwriter who sets the pace for the next decade, a dancer with the wildest feet, a singer who shatters boundaries not only of taste and style but also of skin color, Michael Jackson at 25. Journalist J. Cox for Time, March 19, 1984. The album Thriller, originally titled Starlight, was released on November 29, 1982, and caused a sensation. In the U.S., it stayed at number 1 on the country's main chart for a record-breaking 37 weeks. In the UK, it stayed at number 1 for a whopping 168 weeks. According to the owners of Epic, the label that released the album was selling 500,000 copies a week at its peak. With a single album, Michael pulled the entire music industry out of its doldrums. Album sales began to soar as people often bought several other records when they bought Thriller. In its first year, the album sold over 30 million copies, becoming the best-selling album in music history. Michael Jackson's work maintains that status to this day, with total sales of 70 million copies, including sales of the single Thriller exceeding 122 million copies. All 7 singles released from this album reached the top 10 of the U.S. chart, 2 of which, Beat It and Billie Jean, reached number 1. The first song that launched Michael's new album was the touching ballad duet with Paul McCartney, The Girl Is Mine. It peaked at number 2 on the U.S. chart. It was an excellent result, but it seems everyone expected something more from the collaboration of 2 such huge stars. The song, although modern-sounding with skillful use of synthesizers, was a bit simple. This somewhat lowered expectations for the album, but then, after its release in January 1983, the rhythmic and provocative Billie Jean became the single. The story of a woman who claims to have given birth to Michael's child while he repeatedly repeated, "The kid is not my son," quickly attracted attention. And although Michael himself insisted that the real Billie Jean did not exist and that he was only inspired by the stories of his brothers and acquaintances in the music business, other sources say the opposite, as we have already found out. Musically, this song was distinguished by its pulsating broken rhythm, futuristic synthesizers, and tragic lyrics, delivered by Michael like the most vibrant show imaginable. Critics unanimously named Billie Jean the Song of the Year. A musician always recognizes hit material. It has to feel like one. Everything has to be in the right place. It fills you and makes you feel good. You know everything when you hear the right song. That's how I felt about Billie Jean, Michael Jackson wrote in his book, Moonwalk. The next single from the album would be the catchy Beat It, which Michael wrote entirely himself and didn't want to show to Quincy Jones until the last minute. He was afraid he wouldn't like the song. However, upon hearing it, the producer was delighted. The album was lacking a slightly rocky sound, and Beat It filled that need. The final single from the album, released almost a year after the album's release, was the song Thriller. The song itself is undoubtedly a wonderful piece of work, complementing the album, but its accompanying video had a far greater impact on the music industry. The fact is that in those days, making music videos wasn't a mandatory part of promoting an album and presenting it to audiences. Of course, videos were made, but most of them were simple and simplistic. No one thought that musicians needed to invest in visuals for their albums and make them part of their creative process. But Mike disagreed with this rhetoric. He wanted to create a visual image that people would remember. He wanted to present his music as visually as possible. The video for Thriller took the fashion for music videos to a new level, becoming a must-have for every artist. However, for Michael, Thriller was more than just a video. He was making a real film, as he openly told the entire crew on the first day of shooting. Michael was inspired by classic horror films, which he loved, and decided to recreate a similar atmosphere in his film. The budget for the video was rumored to exceed $1 million, but officially it was only $500,000. The budget was only recouped by selling the rights to premiere and broadcast the video to MTV, which had just launched at the time. We wanted to revive the short film. I wanted Beat It and Thriller to inspire people to make great videos and short films. I saw An American Werewolf in London and really liked it. It was a new subgenre, a comedy horror film. I asked whose film it was, who directed it, and they said John Landis. And I said, great, we need that. We need to contact him. Michael Jackson in the documentary Making Thriller, 1983. The famous zombie dance had to be reworked several times, as it was given special attention in the video. It had to be scary, but still danceable. The result of this painstaking and unique work at the time was the status of the most iconic music video in history. This video remains the first and only one in history to be inducted into the U.S. National Film Registry, a list of the most important films in history. The album Thriller fundamentally changed the sound of music, drawing white people's attention to black music and blending the music of both cultures. For the first time in history, an album had resonated so strongly with the entire American population. The record combined metal, funk, jazz, rock, and the then-emerging synth-pop genre. Michael was one of the first artists to use synthesizers to such an extent in his songs. Electronic drum machines replaced acoustic sets for the first time to create unique sounds in the rhythm section. Layers of synthetic basses, leads, and backing tracks created entirely new musical trends. In other words, Michael Jackson created a new technology with his album, set a new standard in production, and radically changed the sound of music. Almost everything we hear today, from The Weeknd to Billie Eilish, is a consequence of Jackson's revolution. But of course, it's important to note that Madonna and Prince also led this revolution. These three artists are the foundations of modern pop music. Thriller helped change the sound of traditional pop music when the music industry in the early 80s was caught between the fading disco craze and the new craze for synth pop. The album made extensive use of both analog and digital synthesizers, relying on synth bass, synth pads, and strings to create new sounds and timbres. For example, the now popular Linn LM1 drum machine replaced the traditional acoustic drum kit sound, providing rhythmic accompaniment, while the introductory horn sound was created on a Roland Jupiter 8 analog keyboard from Marcus Perry's research paper, analyzing frequently used production elements from the 1980s, noting the musical influence of Michael Jackson, Prince, and Madonna for Belmont University, 2022. The album Thriller won 8 Grammy Awards with an unprecedented 11 nominations. It was a true triumph for Michael Jackson. He released an album that is still considered one of the greatest in human history, if not the greatest. Chapter 18. The Jackson 5's last album and a family quarrel. In 1983, Michael was at the peak of his stage career, but behind the scenes, things weren't going so well. Michael was finding it increasingly difficult to tolerate Joseph's presence in his work, as he was still technically not only the group's manager, but also Michael's. The singer decided to get rid of his entire management team. His father received notice of dismissal for the reasons already clear, but Michael considered the other 2 managers incompetent and lacking good ideas for his career. From then on, John Branca would become his main advisor, manager, and lawyer. Naturally, the family squabbles couldn't help but affect the atmosphere at home, where the Jacksons still lived together. At the same time, he and his brothers were invited to a one-off reunion concert to celebrate Motown's 25th anniversary. Everyone who had ever been part of the label was scheduled to perform their old hits. The event was planned to be taped for television. Michael had to be personally persuaded by Berry Gordy, unlike his brothers, who agreed after the first official invitation. Not only did Michael not want to sing the band's old songs, but he was also prejudiced against television. He considered any appearance on television a cheap move, unworthy of his attention. However, a personal conversation with Gordy softened Michael. He agreed to perform only on the condition that he be allowed to perform the hit Billie Jean after a medley of the band's hits. Motown, of course, had nothing to do with the song from the Thriller album, but Gordy readily agreed to include Michael's worldwide hit in the program. In addition to this condition, Michael wanted to review the finished material before the concert aired. According to Jackson's own recollections, the night before the performance, he didn't have a solo number ready. His entrance with his brothers had been honed and choreographed by Michael himself. He choreographed all the dances for the brothers, but he couldn't come up with his own number. That night, in his kitchen at home, Michael first came up with the idea to use the moonwalk in his act and to wear a hat. On March 25, 1983, the filming of the Motown 25, Yesterday, Today, Forever show was underway. The Jacksons' performance began with old hits, and when the brothers left the stage, Michael, in complete darkness, grabbed his hat from backstage and performed a routine that would forever go down in television history. Of course, Michael didn't invent the famous moonwalk, but he did make the dance move popular and recognizable. For his performance in a black jacket, white glove, and hat, Michael received his first Emmy nomination. The furor at the show proved to be the perfect moment for Joseph to get back into the game. He tried to persuade Michael to record another album with the Jacksons. It's not hard to guess that Michael didn't need the job at best and wasn't interested in it. Nevertheless, the album was recorded, although Michael sang on only 2 songs. After the release of Victory in 1984, all the brothers began talking about a major tour. Even Jermaine, who had been under Berry Gordy's thumb all this time, was finally released from his contract and signed a new deal with Arista Records, which allowed him to tour with his brothers. All those years at Motown had brought Jermaine nothing, so he desperately needed money, just like the other brothers. Their careers were stagnant, there was no income, and Michael was the only breadwinner. This situation needed to be addressed, and the ideal way to do so was a joint tour, which would undoubtedly capitalize on the nostalgia and popularity of a frontman with a dozen worldwide hits under his belt. Michael refused any mention of touring with his brothers. For him, such a tour would not be a lifeline, but a burden he would have to bear. Jackson certainly didn't want that. However, then Catherine entered into the discord between the men of the family. Many call Michael not just a religious man, but rather a devout one. Catherine instilled in him a faith in God. They were both members of the Jehovah's Witnesses Church and regularly attended religious services. His mother's influence on Michael seemed unwavering, so when she decided to talk to her son about touring with his brothers, it was clear the tour would happen. During the preparations for the concerts, Michael was distant and disinterested. This was especially true after he learned of the complex ticket sales scheme. Fans were required to pay full price for tickets, and only in sets of 4, and then the organizers would randomly select those who would actually receive tickets. This scheme would allow the Jacksons to keep far more money in an escrow account than the tour would actually generate. This way, the Jacksons would earn extra money and only then refund the customers who didn't receive their hard-earned money. Michael wasn't happy about it all, but once he agreed to the tour, his opinion of the other brothers and their management proved irrelevant, at least financially. Michael was forced to back down. Afterward, he asked not to tell him about people's dissatisfaction with this system, and there was plenty of it. People were furious at such a complex and opaque sales system. Even with these initial assumptions, all the tickets were sold out, and the brothers were in for a complete sellout. Still, even such a high-profile tour always needs a sponsor. The brothers' new management, hired after firing the people Michael was dissatisfied with, secured them a deal with the Pepsi-Cola brand. Chapter 19: Onset Burns and Substance Abuse. The brothers' contract with PepsiCo and their flagship brand, Pepsi-Cola, included appearing in commercials for the drink. This became the brothers' main goal for 1984. On January 27th, the brothers gathered on the soundstage for the shoot. Michael oversaw the entire process, as he wanted the commercial to be perfect, ambitious, and unique. By that point, Michael Jackson could no longer agree to anything else. Furthermore, the very idea of being a commercial face clearly wasn't the artist's dream. Even his friends, like Paul McCartney, tried to dissuade him. But he needed to help his family, or at least listen to his mother. Michael decided to minimize his reluctance to be the star of a commercial and the risks the project could bring by storyboarding the video. He only allowed a close-up of his face for 4 seconds, so as not to be too conspicuous when people were watching. The rest of the commercial would barely show him. This was clearly not what Pepsi expected from a commercial featuring Michael Jackson himself, but there was no way around it. By the evening of that same day, after lengthy rehearsals, everyone was ready to begin recording. The plan was for Michael to descend from the podium and stand at a spot while pyrotechnics exploded behind him. Several successful takes were filmed, and by the end of the work shift, the director of the commercial asked for a final shot of Michael. Everything was going according to plan, until amid the smoke and sparks from the fireworks, a fire ignited, right on Michael's head. The fire was caused by stupidity, pure and simple, Michael Jackson wrote in Moonwalk. The fire was caused by a miscalculation of the distance between the sparking machines and the spot where Michael was standing. They were simply too close together. Michael's hair eventually caught fire, and although Jackson managed to stay on stage for a few seconds, thinking the heat on his head was caused by the amount of light, when his skin began to burn, he tried to extinguish it with his jacket and fell to the floor. Michael was taken to the hospital with third-degree burns and remained unconscious for some time. To recover, Michael had to undergo scalp retraction surgery. A special bag or expander is inserted under the skin, gradually increasing its volume, thereby stretching the skin. Naturally, this procedure is painful and must be repeated several times. At the beginning of his rehabilitation, Michael refused strong painkillers for religious reasons, but one day in the hospital, the pain became so unbearable that the singer realized he couldn't cope without them. Every researcher of Michael's biography agrees that it was at this point that Michael Jackson developed a dependence on painkillers, which would remain with him until his death. Indeed, in the United States, powerful medications, particularly opioids, are still frequently prescribed today, often without a specific need for such powerful drugs. According to research, American doctors prescribe opioids for pain relief 91% of the time. For cancer patients and those recovering from surgery, such medications are practically mandatory. Dr. Rose A. Rudd and her co-authors, in their article, The Rise of Drug and Opioid Overdose Deaths, state that between 1999 and 2014, 61% of overdoses in the United States were due to opioids. The campaign to more liberally prescribe powerful pain medications began in the 1980s. Michael was hospitalized in 1984. Furthermore, pharmaceutical companies in the United States spent a long time actively convincing the public that such medications were not seriously addictive. Many doctors supported this view. During his recovery, it seemed the entire world supported Michael. Fans sent him gifts and letters, but among all the messages to their idol, there was one special one. Michael received a letter from a boy named Geordie Chandler. Chapter 20. Bad, Michael Jackson, and the war with the tabloids. The media writes strange things about me all the time. I'm concerned about the distortion of facts. I don't usually read most of what's published, but I often hear about what's written. I don't know why they always want to make things up about me. Michael Jackson in Moonwalk. After the release of Thriller, Michael became a frequent guest in mediocre newspapers and tabloids, which didn't hesitate to write articles about him, often completely absurd and scandalous. Of course, many of these articles covered Michael's alleged plastic surgeries, which became increasingly obvious, as Michael's face was indeed changing rapidly. The singer himself did not comment on this at the time. However, it's worth noting that Michael deliberately provoked other articles about his eccentric lifestyle. He was fascinated by the idea of using such fictions and absurdities for PR, so he often played along with journalists eager for a new, even wilder story. Michael believed it was important to add a touch of mystery to his image, to make him look completely different. For example, a photograph of Michael in a hyperbaric chamber, which he allegedly regularly used to maintain his youth, surfaced. The photo was taken at a hospital Michael visited after donating $1.5 million. The chamber was used for the rehabilitation of patients with severe burns, and Michael decided to try it out of curiosity. Ultimately, the photo, as well as the story about his desire for eternal youth, appeared in the press at Jackson's instigation. He decided he needed a big, shocking story to promote his joint project with Disney, the short film Captain EO, which was shown at some Disney theme parks. The film was a sci-fi adventure about the future in space, so the image of Michael in a hyperbaric chamber was perfect. Numerous other rumors surrounded Michael's pet chimpanzee, Bubble. For example, many newspapers seriously reported that singer Prince had cast a spell on the monkey to make it more aggressive. Michael reportedly found this story laughable. There were also rumors that Michael wanted to buy the skeleton of the Elephant Boy, a famous participant in the so-called circus freak show that existed at the end of the last century. Jackson was a fan of the 1980 film The Elephant Man about this character, and after re-watching it again, he devised another media spectacle. To make everything credible, Jackson's team even contacted the London Medical College, where the remains were kept, and offered them $1 million for the skeleton. Of course, their offer was rejected, as expected, but the story ended up in every newspaper and magazine. Further rumors about Michael would become increasingly wild, but he himself would not be involved in all of them. He launched a headline-grabbing machine that would continue to operate without his help for many years to come. Jackson himself would later regret allowing this to happen. There was no longer any line between reality and fantasy. Many would say Michael had lost all connection with real people. But during that period, Michael was surrounded not only by scandals fabricated by the tabloids, but also by scandals caused by his unexpected business decisions. In 1984, Michael bought ATV Music Publishing Company. This company, among other things, owned the catalog of the legendary band The Beatles, of which Michael's close friend Paul McCartney was once a member. The irony of the whole situation with the purchase of the Beatles catalog was that it was Paul who had once told Michael about the benefits of buying the rights to other people's music. The investment was indeed profitable, and Michael was clearly experienced and intelligent enough to understand and take advantage of it. It was just business, nothing personal. Before finally deciding to buy the Beatles' music, Michael managed to acquire the rights to the catalogs of several other artists, including Sly Stone and several Celine Dion songs. The battles and disputes over the value of the company that owned the band's catalog raged for 10 long months, and Michael ultimately bought it for $47.5 million. In today's dollars, that's over $120 million. Paul McCartney himself, of course, also tried to buy the rights to the band's catalog, but he wasn't prepared to spend that much money on his own, and potential partners in the deal refused. Ultimately, Paul simply didn't have the time. After Michael bought the music, McCartney wouldn't even talk to him anymore, and the friendship that had developed during their collaboration was abandoned. Paul would later express dissatisfaction with Michael's handling of the music he'd purchased. "I was working with him and he'd say, 'I'll get your records, I'll get your songs, I'll buy them.' I thought he was joking, but then he actually bought them. The problem is we never agreed to use music in commercials and there were plenty of offers. It's great, but we thought they'd ruin everything. But now that's exactly what's happening. Our songs have become commercial," Paul McCartney said in a 1989 television interview. After this, Paul and Michael would no longer communicate, never reconciling. Meanwhile, after the tragedy on the set of a commercial and the Victory tour with his brothers, Michael returned to solo work, finally disowning the band with a speech at the tour's final show. "This is our final and last show. It's been a long 20 years, Michael Jackson said at the final concert of the Victory tour in Los Angeles, December 9, 1984. The tour wasn't easy for him. He wasn't on speaking terms with his brothers. The atmosphere was tense and everyone was out of place. Michael lost over 20 pounds due to the intense stress. He donated all the money he earned on the tour to charity. In 1985, Michael recorded the charity single "We Are the World." 45 musicians contributed to it, including Tina Turner, Bruce Springsteen, Billy Joel, Stevie Wonder, Diana Ross, Dionne Warwick, and Bob Dylan. All proceeds from the song's sales went to help starving children in Ethiopia. The idea to record the song wasn't Michael's. The We Are the World campaign began with actor and performer Harry Belafonte, who in turn pitched the idea to Ken Cragen. Next came an offer to Lionel Richie, who called Michael. Once Michael took the job, he took charge. According to his sister LaToya, He wrote most of the lyrics and first sang the melody to her in complete darkness so she could appreciate the melody without distraction. You have to be able to touch people without any modern technology, without images, just with sound, Michael Jackson wrote in his book, Moonwalk. Released on January 28, 1985, the song earned over $8 million and topped the American charts for over a month. All of this brings us neatly to the artist's new album. Michael and Quincy Jones faced a difficult task, set by Michael himself, to surpass the success of Thriller. Throughout the preparation of the new album, Michael was obsessed with the idea that the album had to sell 100,000 copies. To achieve such a seemingly impossible feat, many famous artists were supposed to participate in the recording of the album, including Whitney Houston, Barbra Streisand, and Prince, but each of them, one after another, declined to work on the album. It seemed no one wanted to sing backup for Michael Jackson, as it was clear he would still be the star of the song. An interesting story happened with Prince. Michael invited him to sing with him on the song Bad, and in a short film, Michael titled each video this way, they would compete in singing and dancing, fueling rumors of a fierce rivalry between the artists. Prince refused to participate in Michael's latest game with the tabloids. The album title also proved a complete mess. The album was supposed to be called Smooth Criminal. This bold title had already been approved by the label and perfectly suited the concept. Michael wanted to appear more masculine and rugged. However, at the last minute, Jackson changed his mind and urgently called everyone involved with the album's release, declaring that it would never be released under that title. Later, the laconic title, Bad, was chosen. I feel a certain elation after working on an album for so long. It's such a lot of work. People are used to only seeing the end result, but they don't see it all in terms of the work that goes into it. So, yes, I feel elation and joy. It's a jubilation, like a celebration, when we shout, "We did it!" Michael Jackson in an interview for the Ebony/Jet Showcase program, September 1, 1987. Michael's seventh album, Bad, was released on August 31, 1987. It featured 11 songs, chosen from a total of 62 tracks. 9 of the 11 chosen were written by Michael. The album topped the Billboard 200 album chart, and 5 singles from it also reached number 1 on the Billboard 100 singles chart, a record for a single album. It was only surpassed in 2010 by Katy Perry's Teenage Dream. Bad was a successful album, but not as successful as Thriller. Sales of Michael's seventh album are currently estimated at 45 million copies. On the other hand, even this time, Michael managed to change both his own perception and the entertainment industry. Listeners and viewers certainly remember the music videos for each single from the album. I think Bad, in terms of costumes and style, had a much greater cultural impact than Thriller. Maybe the Thriller era was more iconic, but the Bad era had a greater impact. I still dress the same way, Kanye West said in the documentary, Bad 25, 2012. Indeed, even the image from the video for the album's title track remains one of the most recognizable in Michael's career and in pop culture as a whole. The same image was also used on the album cover. The photo shoot took place during breaks between video shoots. The Bad album attempted to portray a rough-and-tumble Michael, but not everyone believed it. Some listeners were simply shocked by the new image, others couldn't connect Michael with his new persona, and still others considered the whole thing a farce and a very naive attempt to portray Michael as the brutal gang leader portrayed in the Martin Scorsese-directed video for Bad. Commercially, Michael was riding high, his popularity remained untouched. After the album's release, he even received an award for his contribution to the video music industry at the MTV Video Music Awards, an award that would later be named in his honor. At the same time, however, the level of criticism directed at Michael had reached critical levels. Tabloid scandals, controversial decisions on the new album, a conflict with Paul McCartney, now one serious misstep or rumor that turned out to be true, could lead to Michael being toppled from the top as quickly as he had been elevated, and journalists, listeners, and ordinary people alike were ready to participate. Michael had become too controversial, enigmatic, and incomprehensible a figure for most people. Grammy Awards added fuel to the fire, where Michael planned to regain public respect and counter the gossip with something truly important. He came to accept the awards for his new album and remind everyone who he was, just as the last nails had been driven into his coffin. Bad hadn't won a single award. Jackson had only one area left in which he excelled: performing. He embarked on a world tour with his new album, and everything fell into place again. Here was the great Michael Jackson, a show everyone should see at least once. At the same moment, Michael officially acquired a title that would forever remain his. At the Soul Train Awards, Michael's close friend, actress Elizabeth Taylor, introduced him as the king of pop, rock, and soul. In fact, Michael's team had been quietly trying to promote this title, but it was Taylor's speech that proved decisive. Chapter 21. Michael's Ranch and the Beginning of the End. The Bad Tour began on February 23, 1988. The show was incredibly technically complex. A huge array of lights, smoke screens that allowed Michael to disappear in one part of the stage and instantly reappear in another. Even today, such stunts can amaze audiences, but back then, it was a true revolution in the concert industry. Michael was also more relaxed on stage than ever before. While dancing, he would frequently grab his crotch, which the female fans undoubtedly loved. During these moments, the audience screamed almost as loudly as during the moonwalk, which had become an integral part of every Michael concert. Of course, such a show is hard work, both emotionally and physically, and even someone like Michael Jackson needs a break sometimes. In any case, it was with this motivation that Michael began to consider buying his own home during the tour. A large space to house his menagerie was important to him. Michael, of course, had not only the chimpanzee Bubbles, but many other animals as well. He also believed it was necessary to show everyone something grandiose, something that would be his own equal. Michael's self-esteem was obviously in good shape. This is how a certain 1,200 square meter estate with over 1,000 hectares of adjacent land appears in the narrative. The ranch, called Sycamore, was located in the Santa Ynez Valley and was used during the filming of the video for the song Say, 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 one of Michael's collaborations with his one-time friend Paul McCartney. It was then that Michael first took an interest in the place but lacked sufficient motivation to buy it. Now, however, Jackson clearly had no desire to be close to his family in Encino. Besides, he was attracting too much attention, and the only way to escape it was to stay away from the noise in an area too large for the paparazzi to track. Michael's lawyer and closest advisor, John Branca, convinced the artist that the ranch wasn't a good investment. The resale potential was extremely low, even though Michael was willing to negotiate with the seller and offer only half the asking price. The ranch was listed for $35 million. The singer was offered several other properties, including a proposal to buy the house and then demolish it and build a completely new one. Michael rejected all offers. He wanted Sycamore Ranch and its 1,000 acres of land. John Branca was furious, but he did a conscientious job. The purchase negotiations were long and difficult, and agreeing on a price was difficult. Not every property owner would agree to sell their property at a 50% discount, but the final price was $17 million. At first, the deal was concluded with Michael's trust listed as the owner, but later the documents were changed to Jackson himself. Now, the land belonged entirely to him. Back then, no one could have imagined the troubles this place would bring Michael, or the attention it would attract for nearly 2 decades. It's unlikely anyone could have imagined that it was there that Michael's career would begin to falter and then crumble into pieces. Every interview recorded in that house would become a scandal, and every guest an accuser. All of this was clearly not what the King of Pop expected from the purchase, but Michael was definitely right about one thing. The ranch, later named Neverland, truly became something grand. Part 2. The Fall. Chapter 22. Neverland. When I created Neverland, I built the world the way I wanted it to be. I wanted it to be a place where sick and disadvantaged children from all over the world could be brought, a haven for them, where they could feel safe and isolated from the world. Michael Jackson in the documentary Take Two, The Footage You Were Never Meant to See, 2003. Soon after purchasing the ranch, Michael began settling into his new home. The empty land and forest on his property were transformed into an amusement park, animal enclosures, and wide roads that could be used to walk or even drive to the main house or, for example, to a private movie theater. The main house on the ranch was given to Jackson fully furnished, including art and historical artifacts from the 18th and 19th centuries. For the artist, this place became an opportunity to relive the childhood he'd been deprived of. While all the other kids around him were playing on playgrounds, making friends, and visiting amusement parks, Michael would perform in nightclubs until the early hours, return home, and go straight to bed to go to school the next morning, then return to rehearsals for his next performance, and so on, repeating the cycle throughout his life. Sycamore Ranch was compensation for those years spent working. It truly did give Michael a childhood for a time, so the name he gave it fully lived up to. The ranch bore the symbolic name Neverland, a land where people never grow up. When I was 12, I was working under contract at Motown. I had to work hard and record music because we had a summer tour coming up soon, and right across from the studio was a children's park. I could hear the kids playing ball, laughing, having fun. I still remember wanting to cross the street and play with them, but I couldn't because I had work, Michael Jackson said in the documentary Take Two, The Footage You Were Never Meant to See, 2002. Neverland quickly came to life. Michael happily hosted various charities, which brought groups of children to the ranch for fun. They had access to rides, a zoo, and a private nature reserve on the grounds. Of course, maintaining Neverland and paying all the staff who worked there cost Michael millions of dollars monthly. However, as Michael himself said, even just one child's smile was worth it. Here I can be myself, create the things I love. Here my passions coincide with the tastes of children, whether they be teenagers or very young children. It's simple. Behind these gates is everything I missed as a child, Michael Jackson said in the documentary Take Two, The Footage You Were Never Meant to See, 2002. Peter Pan occupied a special place in Neverland, which seems logical. A statue of the hero from J.M. Barrie's works was placed at the entrance to the main house. For Michael, this character wasn't just the personification of childhood, but childhood itself. He identified with the character himself, once saying in an interview that he would forever remain Peter Pan and never grow up. Thus, Michael Jackson built his own kingdom, where he could, at least for a little while, be a child. He brought other children there to bring joy and share it, but later, Neverland became home not only to groups of children from hospitals and orphanages, but also to individual young acquaintances of Michael's, whom those around the singer even then nicknamed Special Friends. Chapter 23. Special Friends. During the Bad Tour in 1989, Michael surrounded himself with an entourage of close associates. As his family and work team would later note, these were the only people around him who couldn't refuse him anything. He wanted everything to be on his terms, always. It was at this point that the children of his colleagues or friends he worked with would appear in his circle. In most cases, of course, their parents were also present. Some of the first children around Michael that the public knew about were two boys, Jonathan Spence, whom Michael met back in 1984, and Wade Robson, a young dancer and Michael fan. Not much is known about Michael's relationship with these two boys. Michael met Wade Robson after he won a dance competition before Jackson's concert in Australia. The prize was a meeting with the singer after the show. At the very next concert, Wade performed alongside Michael on stage at his show. Practically nothing is known about Jonathan. Jimmy Safechuck was Michael's third known special friend. He starred with the artist in a Pepsi commercial in 1987, and they became close friends from then on. Michael was also friends with Jimmy's parents. According to Jimmy's mother, Michael made it clear he was very lonely and needed company. The family didn't resist, and accepted all of Michael's offers to spend time together. Furthermore, after filming the commercial, Michael sent a film crew to the Safechuck's home to show the life of a young fan whose dream had come true. The Safechuck family claims he never explained the purpose of the shoot, although the most obvious answer is good PR for Michael. His close relationship with the Safechuck family allowed Michael to take Jimmy with him on tour and travel with him. He took the child shopping, bought him toys, and took him to amusement parks. After the tour, Michael took Jimmy to Neverland and gave his parents a Rolls-Royce. Of course, friendships with children couldn't help but worry Michael's team. For example, one of his managers, Frank DeLeo, suggested cutting ties with the Safechucks, as the press could easily turn the story into a huge scandal. It would hardly have taken much effort, as the friendship was truly strange. Michael flatly refused to change anything or cut off contact with his special friend. There aren't any stars like him anymore. He was a megastar. Everyone wanted to meet Michael to be with him. He was quiet, shy, but also funny. Jimmy Safechuck in the documentary Leaving Neverland, 2019. He was one of the kindest, most gentle and caring people in the world. He helped me so much. With my career, with my art, with absolutely everything, Wade Robson said in the documentary Leaving Neverland, 2019. Chapter 24. Failure in Korea. Michael was enjoying a well-deserved vacation at Neverland when his family re-entered his life. By this time, he had absolutely no desire to get close to them again after the arduous victory tour with his brothers. Michael was tired of being used solely as a source of income by his relatives, especially Joseph. His father repeatedly used Michael's name when trying to implement yet another business plan, whether it was producing a film or purchasing large properties to build bars, recording studios, or private clubs. None of his ideas succeeded, but Michael was the one who got the credit, because his name was always mentioned in Joseph's every project. For this reason, the day his mother called the Jackson estate with yet another request for a joint tour, Michael lost his temper and immediately refused. The Jackson family received a concert offer while Michael was on the bad tour, and negotiations began without his knowledge. Catherine and Joseph were approached by representatives of the South Korean religious movement Unification Church, led by Sun Myung-moon. The movement's followers were called Moonies, precisely because of their leader. The movement wanted to enhance its prestige and influence, and perhaps even attract new followers by organizing large-scale concerts for the Jacksons at a stadium in Seoul. They would act as organizers and sponsors, while Catherine and Joseph would promote the upcoming 4 shows. This arrangement suited the Jackson family, as by that time, not only the brothers were experiencing financial difficulties, but also Joseph himself, who had fallen into debt due to the failure of yet another business venture. Incidentally, it was precisely because he had once again implicated Michael's name that Joseph, for obvious reasons, refused to help. The only ones who categorically refused to participate in the Korean project were Janet. Her own career was rapidly developing at the time, and she simply didn't need family shows. And Marlon, who had fallen out with Michael and didn't want to get involved in arduous touring again. The plan seemed perfect. The Koreans only needed the brothers, and they had already agreed. The Jacksons needed the money, and they would get enough to split between them, about $7 million per show, plus $1.5 million for production. There was one catch. The Moonies needed Michael. Otherwise, there would be no concerts. After Catherine and Joseph failed to negotiate with Michael over the phone, the Korean representatives tried to get hold of the artist's manager, Frank DeLeo. He was offered $1 million to try to persuade Michael to perform. Ironically, a few days after the Koreans' offer, Frank was fired by Michael for personal reasons. The family was forced to negotiate with Michael again. The Moonies offered an additional $1 million to any family member who could secure Michael's signature. Naturally, the entire family joined the race for the extra cash. Furthermore, all the Jacksons were bribed with expensive gifts, including luxury cars. Catherine was the first to receive the payment for Michael's persuasion. They had high hopes for her, as she had already managed to persuade Michael to tour with his brothers, but this time the singer was much more independent and decisive. Even a telephone conversation with the promoter himself failed to convince Michael. Catherine handed the phone over to them immediately after speaking with her son. Michael's mother's money was ultimately confiscated as the singer had failed to be persuaded. The South Korean concerts dragged on for weeks, and when Michael grew tired of listening to pitiful persuasion and enduring endless phone calls, letters, and faxes, he agreed. They would never leave him alone, so it was easier to play 4 shows and forget about it. However, the problems with the Seoul tour didn't end there. Once the deal was finalized, Sun Myung-moon was dissatisfied with the terms. Michael had demanded a separate payment of $8 million for himself for the performance, where he would sing 4 of his own songs and a medley of the group's hits. Moon first demanded that Michael's fee be reduced to $7 million, then halved, and finally the price dropped so much that the deal began to fall apart. The Korean concerts never materialized. In the summer of 1989, the deal was finally broken, and the Moonies demanded the return of all gifts from the Jacksons. Surprisingly, Michael stood up for the family, filing a lawsuit against the organization. Everything the Moonies had given the Jacksons remained in the family. After this, Michael would never again participate in joint projects with the family. Their relationship remained cold and distant. Chapter 25. The Dangerous Album. Michael Jackson's career, by definition, couldn't stand still. The artist always had a desire to create something new, ambitious, and sell well. Michael wasn't satisfied with the results of Bad, as his plan to surpass Thriller's sales record had failed to materialize. He was frustrated and overwhelmed by the pressure he was putting on himself. His team and label, CBS, understood his state, so no one was in a rush to offer him work on new projects, especially anything large-scale. Towards the end of 1989, when Michael turned 31, the idea of releasing a hits compilation, tentatively titled Decade, was floated. The idea was first floated by John Branca, and Michael trusted him enough to seriously consider the proposal. The album was planned to include 4 songs from the breakthrough Off the Wall, 7 from Thriller, 6 from Bad, and 3 to 5 completely new songs. That same year, Michael signed a new deal with CBS, or more precisely, with their parent company, Sony. At the time, this contract became one of the largest and most lucrative in artist history. The royalty rate for Michael ranged from 25 to 29% of sales, compared to 12% for major stars and 18% for celebrities like Madonna. Michael also had the opportunity to create his own label and earn $120 million for recording new material within 6 years of its release, but only if sales matched those of the legendary Thriller. Otherwise, Michael would be left with nothing. His future well-being and career now depended entirely on the new release. The situation was troubling but ultimately beneficial for the artist. Adding fuel to the fire was the end of Michael's collaboration with his longtime friend and business partner, Quincy Jones. Michael believed Jones was taking too much credit for Jackson's work, creating the impression that Michael couldn't have written anything worthwhile without Jones. Quincy, meanwhile, became concerned about Jackson's stubbornness and increasing demands. However, contrary to rumors, Quincy and Michael parted ways amicably, maintaining mutual respect and gratitude for their past collaborations. We fought. We disagreed on a lot of things. When we argued, it was about new things and the latest technology. I told Quincy that music is always changing. I want the newest drum sound that can be made. I want to be ahead of the curve, Michael Jackson wrote in his autobiography, Moonwalk. Besides Quincy, Michael also fired most of his team. Some were fired for lack of creativity, others because of Michael's paranoia. The artist suspected that one of them was leaking personal information about his life to the tabloids. In short, Michael's previous work routine was over, and he now had to surprise listeners with something new. From a music industry perspective, Jackson also found himself in a precarious position. Surprising listeners with the visuals of an album had become much more difficult. something Michael himself had largely contributed to, and listeners' musical tastes had changed significantly while he was on tour. The commercial pop music of the 1980s had given way to rap, hip-hop culture, and grunge, celebrated by bands like Nirvana, led by Kurt Cobain. More contemporary, so-called urban genres dominated the charts. The leading artists of the early 90s were Public Enemy and Janet Jackson, Michael's sister, who released the album Rhythm Nation 1814, which skillfully blended R&B, hip-hop, and even rock music. The release of the Hits compilation Decade was repeatedly delayed, even though the cover and final track listing were already complete. It would have included, for example, the new song Black or White and several covers of Beatles songs Michael had purchased. The cover featured Michael's profile carved into a light beige stone with the album title engraved beneath. This concept would later be reflected on the artist's next album, released in 1995. As for the Hits compilation, after yet another delay, it faded into obscurity. The release was canceled, and Michael decided to release a completely new album, working on new compositions. Of course, for Jackson, such a move was risky and dangerous, but it's unlikely that Michael ever feared it. Otherwise, the world would never have seen Thriller and its revolutionary music videos. To work on the album, Michael personally invited young hip-hop producers, including, for example, Teddy Riley, known today to listeners for his work on I Like the Way, The Kissing Game, by the R&B quintet High Five, and No Diggity by Blackstreet. We talked constantly. Before I took over producing the album, he described everything he was looking for sonically. He played one of my band Guy's songs and said he wanted that exact sound. He wanted something with that same drive. From a Teddy Riley interview, 2008. With Teddy Riley, Michael would record the album's future title track and one of the album's biggest hits, Remember the Time. In the final weeks leading up to the release, Michael and his team worked so hard on the album that they decided to book rooms at a hotel near the studio where they could sleep for a few hours and then get right back to work. Just days before the deadline, Michael was still recording new songs and couldn't stop. He needed the perfect album. Before sending the final track listing to the label, Michael played the album to Quincy Jones to make sure it was a success. Quincy approved, and only then was Dangerous truly ready for release. Dangerous embraces new musical genres, not simply repeating what's trendy but creating something unique and transcendent, as has been the case throughout Michael's career. The album features sounds reminiscent of urban genres, street music, like breaking glass or scraping metal. It also features pulsating beats and rap straight out of hip-hop, and of course, the buzzing guitars of rock. Michael introduced fans to a new era of his music, and at the same time, proved he could create without Quincy Jones. The cover for Michael Jackson's 8th album was created by surrealist artist Mark Ryden. The album artwork was the most complex and detailed of Michael's career. While all previous works featured simple portrait photographs and a stylized album title, this one created a veritable pattern of details, characters, objects, references, and hidden meanings, behind which a portrait of Michael was hidden. The cover, chosen from 4 of Ryden's sketches, was hand-painted by the artist. The work took about 6 months. Michael was open enough to let me work. He made a few additions once the painting was finished. He wanted his friend Macaulay Culkin to be depicted on one of the rides in the lower right corner. He also wanted a boy in the painting, half white, half black. From an interview with Mark Ryden. The cover also features a monkey, which is clearly a reference to Michael's pet chimpanzee, Bubbles, and an elephant with the number 9 on its head, a reference to the number of children in the Jackson family. The work centers on a dark industrial city, a reference to the 1927 film Metropolis. Furthermore, the central imagery of the work is dedicated to theater, the circus, and the entertainment industry, in other words, Michael's life. 9 singles were released by the album's release, but unfortunately, only one of them managed to reach the top of the Billboard 100 chart. The song, with its social message about equality and acceptance in this world, Black or White, was undoubtedly one of the highlights of Michael's career, But a #1 hit wasn't enough for Michael to consider the album a success. Commercially, the album certainly didn't match the success of Thriller. Sales increased significantly during Michael's new tour, but Jackson still couldn't achieve anything more than that. Critics weren't kind either. Most reputable publications called the album chaotic, inconsistent, and downright weak. While there were a few articles that praised the album, it was a failure for Michael. Of all the strange phenomena in modern popular music, nothing is stranger than Michael Jackson singing generic love songs on his first album since 1987, Dangerous. He barely manages to squeeze them out. But more than ever, his lyrics aim to speak to the desires of the most banal majority. They seem based on demographic research rather than experience and imagination. This is his least confident album since he became a solo superstar, music critic John Perels wrote for the New York Times, November 24, 1991. The aggressive yet smooth dance grooves that Teddy Riley helped create, and writing grooves, not traditional songs, is his forte, proved a perfect match for Jackson's staccato, raspy voice, singing at a fast tempo. The combination is especially striking in the songs dedicated to women. Exactly half of Dangerous is devoted to matters of the heart, and here Jackson's greatest fears come to the fore. There's not a single straightforward love song in this bunch, music critic Alan Light wrote for Rolling Stone, January 1, 1992. Following the release of the new album, Michael decided to get involved in philanthropy and created the Heal the World Foundation, which focused on helping children from poor families and those suffering from the consequences of war, poverty, and disease. The idea of helping those in need, of course, resonated perfectly with the songs Black or White and Heal the World. In Michael's career, everything had always had to happen at the right moment. But in his personal life, many events turned out to be unplanned, and one such event was already on its way. Chapter 26. Geordie Chandler. May 1992. A broken-down SUV was parked on Wilshire Boulevard in Beverly Hills. The driver paced around nervously, kicking the tires and trying to call 911. There, however, he was told that their service was for emergencies, and a broken-down car wasn't one of them. Luckily, there was a car rental shop called Rent-A-Wreck nearby. The owner noticed the desperate driver and invited him inside to rent a car instead of leaving it sitting idle on the side of the road. The entire family of owner Dave Schwartz was already waiting for Michael Jackson at the rental shop. He managed to call them and tell them about the person he saw on the road before calling Michael over. While Jackson was completing the necessary paperwork to rent a car, June Chandler Schwartz, his ex-wife and mother of Schwartz's son, pestered him. She talked about her son being a longtime fan of the artist and suggested they exchange phone numbers so they could call each other when Michael had time. It was then, at the car dealership, that Michael first officially met 12-year-old Geordie Chandler. The boy's surname comes from his biological father. Dave Schwartz was his stepfather and the second husband of his mother, June. Geordie was a creative child, and thanks to his father, he already had a chance to work in Hollywood at such a young age. The family sold his idea for a Robin Hood parody, which later became the film Men in Tights. Geordie was truly a fan of Michael. As we recall, the boy was among those who sent Michael a letter of support while he was hospitalized with head burns following an accident filming a Pepsi commercial. Later, in 1989, Michael's team contacted the Chandlers and offered them free tickets to a Michael concert as a token of their gratitude. They, of course, accepted, hoping to meet Jackson in person after the show. To the Chandlers' chagrin, this didn't happen, but who would have thought that they would only have to wait 3 years to meet? Naturally, a week later, Michael called Geordie. This was a predictable decision on the artist's part, given his own trauma with his lost childhood and his desire to relive it as an adult. This, in part, fueled his overwhelming desire to help children, spend time with them, and make them happy. After all, Neverland was constantly expanding with new attractions for a reason. In the summer of 1992, Michael was scheduled to embark on his Dangerous World Tour. The first leg was scheduled from June 27th to December 31st. The second leg of the tour was spread throughout 1993. Jackson and the Chandlers were upset that they wouldn't be able to see each other for the rest of the tour, but work was still more important to Michael. The show, in true Michael tour tradition, was technically complex and included not only the usual tons of pyrotechnics, dozens of dancers, and complex choreography, but also special numbers, such as Michael's flight over the stadium in a real spacesuit at the end of each show. And yet, despite the tiring and physically demanding tour, Jackson found time to call Geordie every evening. They spent hours talking about typical teenage topics. Geordie was 13 at the time: games, hobbies, and school. Michael also told Geordie about Neverland and all the entertainment it offered. Of course, the child wanted to be in this children's paradise. By the time the first half of the tour ended, the tour's gross was already approaching $100 million in 1993 dollars. Today, the tour's gross is estimated at $210 million. Michael returned to Neverland, decorated for the New Year and Christmas by his close friend Elizabeth Taylor. It was her gift to him in honor of the return of the King of Pop. Of course, Michael immediately wanted to invite the Chandlers to his place, at least to show off the lavish set, but Jackson had commitments that required his full attention and rigorous rehearsals, so the meeting was postponed again. The National Football League, NFL, and American Football League, AFL, championship game, known to many as the Super Bowl, began in the 1960s, gaining increasing popularity with spectators each year. At halftime, it was common practice to bring college bands and choirs into the stadium to entertain fans waiting for the game to continue. However, over time, college bands were replaced by stars like Ella Fitzgerald, and the performances themselves began to attract increasing attention. But of course, the biggest change in the prestige and importance of the halftime performances occurred on January 31st, 1993, when Michael Jackson was the only performer. The show Michael created was so large-scale and spectacular that it simply stole the spotlight from the game itself. At the end of his performance, Michael was joined by a children's choir of 3,500 children, with whom he sang his hit, "Heal the World." It would have been difficult to imagine a more touching and spectacular ending. Michael revolutionized the industry once again. After his performance, major stars would be invited to the Super Bowl every year, and the competition for the most spectacular and large-scale performance among artists continues to this day. Immediately after the Super Bowl, Michael had another important work commitment. In February, he gave a high-profile interview with Oprah Winfrey. The main topics of the hour-long special with Michael were plastic surgery, all the gossip that has circulated about him in recent years, and, of course, his skin color change. The fact is that, starting with the release of his album Thriller, Michael's skin will change every year as rapidly as his face. And while the changes in the shape of his nose or chin were explained by simple plastic surgeries, which Michael himself, however, never acknowledged, his skin tone, which by 1993 was completely white, without the slightest hint of African American descent, raised far more questions. First of all, there is no such thing as skin bleaching. I have a skin condition that destroys the pigmentation of my skin. I can't do anything about it, Michael Jackson said in an interview with Oprah Winfrey, February 1993. It was then that Michael first admitted that in the mid-1980s he had been diagnosed with vitiligo, a condition that causes skin pigmentation disorders. Michael's mother, Catherine, would later confirm this version, although she would say that skin lightening procedures had indeed taken place. He suffered from vitiligo. Michael went to a dermatologist to have his complexion evened out, but his legs and everything else were covered in spots. He didn't want it to be visible. The only parts of his body that were bleached were his face, arms, chest, and neck. He did it to look less bad, Catherine Jackson said in the 2011 documentary Michael Jackson, An Icon's Life. Furthermore, it was later revealed that by the late 1980s, Michael's dermatologist had diagnosed him with discoid lupus, which also affected his skin, and as treatment, Michael was prescribed creams containing Soliquin, Retin A, and Benekin, which have skin-lightening properties. As for plastic surgery, by the time of his interview with Oprah, it was already obvious how extensively Michael had altered his face, but he never said anything specific in the interview. "I've had very little plastic surgery. You can count them on 2 fingers. Let's put it this way. If every person in Hollywood who had plastic surgery left town, there would be no one left here." Michael Jackson in an interview with Oprah Winfrey, February 1993. The interview had a positive impact on Michael's reputation. If anything, the aura of mystery and eccentricity had faded somewhat from his image. Immediately after the controversial Oprah appearance, Michael invited Geordie Chandler and his family, his mother June, and her youngest daughter Lily, to Neverland. They played video games, rode rides, and watched unreleased movies together in a separate theater on the ranch grounds. Hollywood studios always graciously provided any new releases at Michael's request. After their weekend visit to Neverland, the Chandler family went shopping with Michael, where he allowed the children to collect as many toys as they wanted. That day, Michael spent $10,000. Quickly, Michael's relationship with Geordie became so close and warm that Michael was willing to confide in the family with virtually all his secrets. For example, when Michael appeared at the Soul Train Awards in a wheelchair, ostensibly due to an injury, the Chandlers were the first to discover it was merely a publicity stunt. Michael also showed them the secret apartments in Los Angeles where he lived most of the time. Though Michael enjoyed his stay at Neverland, the ranch was too far from the city where he always had work. Jackson's team didn't interfere with his relationship with Geordie and his mother. Everyone in Michael's circle had already become accustomed to having children around him, whether they were groups sent by charity organizations to Neverland or his special friends, who, as we've already established, began appearing around him back in the 80s and then just as quickly vanishing. In March 1993, Michael, Geordie, June, and Lily traveled to Las Vegas together. Michael paid for everyone's rooms at the Mirage Hotel. The odd thing about this trip was that Geordie's mother and younger sister were staying in a separate room, while Michael and Geordie shared the same room, albeit in separate rooms. This fact alone would have alarmed June, but it seems her trust in Michael outweighed her concerns. That night, Michael and Geordie watched the 1973 film The Exorcist together. The film frightened Geordie so much that he asked to sleep with Michael. According to the Chandlers' version of events, which would emerge later, it was Michael who suggested sleeping together. In any case, that night was their first time sleeping together. In the morning, Geordie himself admitted to June that he and Michael had slept together, and then the boy's mother finally realized that their intimacy was strange. She immediately tried to confront Michael and accuse him of something very wrong, but Michael managed to convince her that he would never harm the boy. Following this argument, Michael unexpectedly gave June a $12,000 ruby bracelet. Coincidentally, after this gift, June remained devoted to Michael, and the topic of sleepovers was never raised again. However, there was still one person in the family who was not happy with this relationship: Geordie's biological father, Evan Chandler. Evan was furious when he learned that his 13-year-old son was sleeping in the same bed with a 34-year-old man. June tried to calm him down, saying that Michael was harmless and that he himself was acting like a child. The boy's father was unconvinced. He decided to meet Michael in person to express his displeasure. Fortunately, this only required a visit to his ex-wife's home, as Michael often visited them and played with Geordie. Evan asked Michael directly about his sexual relationship with his son, but at that point, Michael managed to convince Evan that nothing untoward had happened between them. Michael convinced him either by saying he would never hurt a child or by giving him a Cartier watch the next day. For a time, things between the Chandlers and Jackson returned to normal, but journalists intervened. In May 1993, Michael took June, Geordie, and his younger sister Lily to Monaco for a music awards ceremony. Their joint appearances in the Principality caused a huge media frenzy worldwide. Photos were splashed across every publication, from small tabloids to major publications. Many called the Chandlers Michael's new adoptive family, which, understandably, angered Evan. Looking at photos of his son Jordy sitting on Michael Jackson's lap, he realized it was time to deal a real blow to this friendship. Chapter 28. The First Accusations. In June 1993, Evan Chandler decided to take extreme measures to separate Michael and Jordy. He filed a petition to change his custody arrangements for his son. This petition was the first to mention Evan's suspicions of inappropriate behavior by Michael. He demanded that Michael be restrained from seeing his son, and in his testimony, he described all of Michael's calls to Jordy and their sleepovers together. Evan tried to win over June's second husband, Dave Schwartz, but he was devoted to his wife and Michael, so when they met, he denied there was anything strange or wrong with Jordy and Michael's relationship. Evan was left alone. His son and ex-wife were deliberately ignoring him, not communicating with him. He and Michael decided that Evan was a real problem, preventing them from living peacefully. Evan also tried to contact Michael himself, but the conversation never took place. A month later, on July 8th, Evan spoke with Dave again, this time over the phone. Dave successfully recorded the conversation, which would later be used in Michael's trial. In this conversation, Evan lamented that Jordy only liked Michael because of the expensive gifts and trips his father couldn't afford. He was also unhappy that Michael himself hadn't contacted him, even though they had previously agreed to maintain a friendly relationship, apparently when Michael gave him an expensive watch. Evan's suspicions about Michael's possible inclinations or abuse of Jordy were never voiced. At this point, a theory arose in Michael's circle that Evan needed money from Michael, and that the suspicions of pedophilia were merely an excuse to squeeze more out of Michael than would have been possible had they remained friends. Further events unfolded so rapidly that journalists studying Michael's biography often summarize them in a single sentence: Michael Jackson was accused of pedophilia. However, in reality, a chain of events preceded the official charges, making them so controversial. On July 9th, June and Dave provided a recording of the phone call to investigators and played it for Michael to make clear that Evan was a real threat. On July 10th, investigator Anthony Pellicano questioned Jordy, and after 2 hours of conversation with the teenager, he concluded that there had been no illicit relationship between him and the artist. Immediately afterward, custody documents were signed transferring custody to Evan Chandler, and June handed Jordy over to him. The custody order stipulated that Jordy's mother could not take him outside the city limits, which meant only one thing for her. From that moment on, the road to Neverland was closed. When June handed her son over to her ex-husband, doubts about Michael's innocence were already growing within her. Police officials interviewed by the Chandler family's lawyers had information that there was another victim of Michael's abuse. However, this information could not be confirmed. June and Michael's relationship had cooled. They could no longer see or speak to each other at the insistence of their lawyers. On August 2nd, Evan, a dentist, intended to extract Jordy's toothache, but used sodium amytal, a barbiturate derivative, as an anesthetic. It was previously used in psychiatry as a sedative and for the treatment of amnesia, but it had long since fallen out of use because it is addictive and a narcotic. Nevertheless, Evan Chandler used this very drug. The fact is that sodium amytal was previously considered a kind of truth serum, although in reality, of course, it was not. Many even believe one of the drug's side effects is the exact opposite of truth serum, increased suggestibility. That day, under the influence of drugs, Jordy Chandler confessed to his father that he and Michael Jackson had had a sexual relationship. On August 4th, investigator Anthony Pellicano arranged a meeting between Evan Chandler, Jordy, and Michael. Just before the meeting, Evan's lawyer contacted a psychiatrist he knew, Mathis Abrams, and described the history of Jordy and Michael's relationship, including sleeping together, hours-long phone conversations that Jordy never discussed in detail, and Michael's unhealthy love for children. Even though Jordy had never seen a psychiatrist or been seen by one, the doctor had enough information to issue a report, the conclusion of which was unequivocal. Michael had pedophilic tendencies and had definitely had sexual relations with 13-year-old Geordie Chandler. The doctor's report put Evan in a strong position, meaning he could dictate the terms. $20 million in an interest-bearing account, $5 million of which would go directly to Geordie for his education, and the case would be settled out of court. The terms of Evan and his lawyers were completely transparent and well-prepared. They knew what they wanted from Michael. To their disappointment, Michael's team refused, but countered. Michael offered to pay $350,000 each for any 3 scripts from the Chandlers. As we recall, Geordie already had experience developing ideas for future films, and his patronage, Michael was willing to submit the scripts to major studios for review. This time it was Evan who refused. Following several days of unsuccessful negotiations, a real psychiatric evaluation followed, with Geordie's direct participation. During this evaluation, he suddenly revealed for the first time how and when his sexual relationship with Michael began. Under U.S. law, doctors are required to report such cases to the appropriate authorities. Following the disclosure of information about a child who had been abused, an investigation into suspected child molestation by Michael Jackson began on August 18th. Chapter 29. A Strange Case. On August 21, 1993, a search warrant was issued for 5225 Figueroa Mountain Road. Police officers examined the Neverland Ranch down to the last millimeter, removing every sheet and turning over every photo album in search of incriminating photographs. They even broke into Michael's personal safe, according to his maid Adrienne McManus, finding only the combination to it. During the search, only erotic magazines were found. These would later become the only physical evidence the prosecution could use in the case, although they contained nothing illegal. At the time, Michael was again on tour in Asia. His visit to Russia was only 3 weeks away. 2 days later, on August 23rd, the media reported the first reports of a search of Michael's home, followed by a veritable blizzard of shocking news. While Michael continued touring, he received phone support from Elizabeth Taylor and Lisa Marie Presley, the daughter of legendary musician Elvis Presley. But it seems his greatest support during this period was far from his friends. With each passing day of the tour, Michael became increasingly addicted to the drugs he had been using since his head burns in 1984: Valium, Xanax, Ativan, Demidrol, and Codeine. After each concert, Michael was dehydrated and exhausted, the strain and stress taking their toll. The final concerts of the tour were canceled, after which Michael went to rehab in London for a time. On December 10, 1993, Michael returned to the States. A criminal investigation was underway against him, and a civil lawsuit was being prepared by the Chandlers. By that time, Geordie had already given a statement in which he not only described but also drew the artist's genitals. Naturally, the most reliable way to verify the authenticity of the boy's testimony was to examine Michael's body and compare the nude photographs with Geordie's drawing. The procedure was scheduled for December 20th, and it all took place at Neverland. During the strip search, not only doctors and investigators were present in the house, but also District Attorney Thomas Snedden, who had been assigned to prosecute the case. Michael objected to this procedure, and it was painful and humiliating for him. In addition to a visual examination, every part of his body was photographed and discussed in front of him. A major question for investigators was whether Michael Jackson was circumcised, as the drawing and Geordie's testimony clearly stated that he was circumcised. According to the doctor's conclusion, Michael was not circumcised. The discrepancies between Geordie's testimony and the actual painting led the court to doubt the veracity of the teenager's account. Meanwhile, the media dissected Michael's case. Every tabloid and tabloid newspaper had long been itching to tear Michael apart, having already made millions from rumors about the hyperbaric chamber, the elephant boy's bones, and speculation about Michael's skin color. They just needed a pretext to set the machine in motion to completely destroy Jackson's reputation. After the humiliating procedure, Michael released a public statement, recorded right there at Neverland. The media has taken every opportunity to dissect and manipulate the allegations to prove their own point. I ask you all to wait and hear the truth before you brand me. Don't treat me like a criminal because I am innocent. From Michael Jackson's official statement, December 22, 1993. The final blow that finished Michael off was a statement from his sister, LaToya, in which she supported the accusations against her brother. Michael is my brother. I love him very much, but I cannot and will not be a silent accomplice to his crimes against small, defenseless children, LaToya Jackson said at a press conference in Tel Aviv, December 1993. Michael's family, including his mother, Catherine, immediately held a press conference to declare LaToya's claims a lie. By then, LaToya had long since estranged herself from the family, having married unsuccessful businessman Jack Gordon, who tried to help her with her career. However, all his proposals ended with bombastic allegations about the Jackson family, which the couple sold to tabloids for an average of $50,000 to $100,000. At the time of her statement from Israel, LaToya had not spoken to Michael for several years, meaning she had no idea who Jordy Chandler was or what her relationship with Michael had been. All the information LaToya and Jack possessed was gleaned from the media and news headlines. By January, the Los Angeles police had already spent a staggering $2 million on the investigation and interviewed everyone who worked with Michael. Investigators also identified virtually every child Jackson had ever been friends with. None of them confirmed having had sexual relations with the artist. Among those who came to Michael's defense at the time were Wade Robson and Jimmy Safechuck. Both young men testified in Michael's favor, despite having not spoken to him for some time. Circumstantial evidence, potential inconsistencies in Jordy's testimony, and the fact that the teenager's confession was obtained while under the influence of drugs, not the best combination for a successful criminal case. The prosecutor's office decided not to bring criminal charges against Jackson. Michael's side won the civil case, in part due to the same circumstantial evidence. All that remained was the Chandlers' direct accusations. Michael's team had to press the case, which would not have been difficult given the lack of witnesses, other victims, and direct evidence, not to mention the holes in Jordy's testimony and his illegal confession. But Michael was so exhausted by the trial, so crushed, that he and Lisa Marie Presley decided to reach a settlement with the Chandlers. Jackson was prepared to pay them the money they had asked for from the very beginning. On January 25, 1994, the deal was officially finalized. Michael paid the family $22 million, 15 of which went to a trust in Jordy's name, $2 million were distributed among the boys' parents, and the rest went to the Chandlers' lawyers. Upon the court's approval of this confidential settlement agreement, Jackson will sign and deliver to the minors' attorneys formal acknowledgments of claims in forms to be approved by the minors' attorneys in fact prior to the execution of this confidential settlement agreement, in the total amount of $15,331,250.00, which will be held in trust by the minors' attorneys in fact, with no copies to be made or made available to any other person, according to the published settlement documents between Michael Jackson and Evan Chandler, 1994. Michael was convinced from the outset that Chandler Sr.'s primary motive was extortion, and so it turned out. After the payment, the Chandlers had no further claims against Michael and did not participate in any subsequent investigations. Chapter 30. Lisa Marie Presley. And just think, no one imagined it would last. Michael Jackson at the MTV Video Music Awards, 1994. I don't know how it didn't get into the press because we were completely open about it. We were together in Las Vegas, Neverland, bookstores, everywhere. We didn't hide anything. I'd been divorced for 4 months and he asked me what I would do if he proposed marriage. I said I would. Lisa Marie Presley in an interview with Diane Sawyer on Primetime Live, 1994. Michael and Lisa met as children when Lisa Marie was taken to a Jackson concert in 1974. She liked Michael, but they didn't even have the chance to become friends. Fate brought them together again in February 1993 at a dinner for mutual friends. Michael then managed to charm the girl with stories about his life and work. From that day on, they spoke frequently on the phone, and surprisingly, Michael opened up to Lisa as a simple man. She could talk to him honestly about her marriage. At the time, she was married to musician Danny Keough, with whom she had 2 children, and how unhappy she was with her husband. Michael was understanding, although he also openly flirted with Lisa, which surprised her no less than his empathy and ability to reason like a simple man, not a global superstar. As it turned out, Michael's entire public image, which he had spent years building around himself like a brick wall, was a complete fabrication. Lisa fell in love with the real Michael Jackson. The connection between them was strong, but it was more akin to the romances Michael had with Brooke Shields and Tatum O'Neal. When the Chandler investigation began, Michael began calling Lisa, who had been his support system, more frequently. Michael needed someone close to him while he was thousands of miles from home on tour, his career and reputation hanging by a thread. Lisa became that person. It was she who persuaded him to enter rehab in London instead of his final scheduled concerts. After the Geordie case was closed and Michael, after consulting with Lisa, agreed to pay off the Chandler family, he and Presley began an affair. They traveled to Las Vegas together in February 1994, and by May they had decided to marry. It was a surprise to me. I found out from the news on TV. When he called, I asked if it was true that he had married Lisa Marie Presley. He replied that it was true. That's why he called Katherine Jackson in the documentary Michael Jackson, The Life of an Icon, 2011. There were many rumors about their marriage, including that Michael only wanted Lisa to restore his reputation, while Lisa needed Michael to jumpstart her career. There was no confirmation of these rumors. They spent about a year together, but at some point, their relationship began to cool. Michael never got along with Lisa's children, and Lisa herself was unhappy with Jackson's always prioritizing his career over his wife. The final straw was Michael's decision not to give up his special friends, which of course seemed odd after the incident with Chandler. In July 1995, Michael left for Paris with his 2 teenage brothers, Eddie and Frank Cassio. A few months after this incident, the couple barely spoke to each other. It seemed like their divorce was just a matter of time, especially since Michael had already begun to get closer to another woman. The divorce was finally finalized in August 1996. Michael became single again. Chapter 31. His story. In 1995, Jackson returned to work after a brief rest and lull. The result of his labors was the album His Story. The title was a play on the words history and his story. This time, the album was a reminder of Michael's greatness. Side 1 featured 15 of his greatest hits: Thriller, Billie Jean, Beat It, Black or White, and others. Side 2 featured 15 completely new tracks, the most notable of which were Stranger in Moscow, written in Moscow, right at the Metropole Hotel, a duet with his sister Janet Jackson, Scream, and of course, the mournful Earth Song. The album concluded with an aggressive release of all of Michael's pent-up pain, the poignantly socially charged song, They Don't Care About Us. The album debuted at number 1 on the US album chart, but its sales, compared to Michael's previous work, Dangerous, left much to be desired. The album sold 15 million copies, while Dangerous had 27 million. However, in his usual manner, Michael managed to outdo himself here too. One of the album's singles, You Are Not Alone, a touching ballad about always having someone close by, became the first ever to debut at number 1 on the Billboard 100 singles chart. The song perfectly captured Michael's life over the past few years, the media attacks, the accusations, and then his marriage to Lisa Marie, and his eventual salvation from all adversity. Furthermore, director Mark Romanek shot another massive music video for another song from the album, Scream, considered the most expensive music video in history at the time. The project's budget was $7 million. The director of Scream claimed that videos with higher budgets already existed at the time, but there's no evidence to support this. This video still holds the title of the highest budgeted. For the album's promotional campaign, statues of Michael similar to the one on the cover were erected in several cities around the world. One was even towed down the Thames in London so as many people as possible could see it. The album's publicity was magnificent. The biggest problem with Michael's new album was that no one was interested in it. The media was still discussing his personal life and the accusations, which occupied far more airtime and attracted more viewers than history. The subsequent 1997 remix collection, Blood on the Dance Floor, featuring 5 new songs, remains largely unknown to most casual listeners, even though it featured the wonderful song Ghost, which many fans consider one of the best of the artist's career. After the album's release, Michael planned a new tour, which included another visit to Moscow, while his personal life was once again in turmoil. Chapter 32. Michael's Children. Michael met nurse Debbie Rowe back in the mid-1980s. She worked as an assistant to his dermatologist, the same one who diagnosed him with vitiligo and prescribed skin-lightening creams. Debbie even personally helped Michael apply the cream once. He and Debbie hit it off quickly. Jackson trusted the nurse. At first, he only called Debbie about medical matters, asking about doctor appointments, delivering prescriptions, or clarifying something. But then they began to talk about personal matters, seeing each other often, and became good friends. It seems Debbie was the only person in Michael's inner circle unknown to both fans and the media. Debbie Rowe's name first surfaced in the news when a private conversation she had with a friend, in which she revealed she was pregnant with Michael's child, was leaked. They had been intimate while Michael was still married to Lisa Marie. There was no romantic or sexual attraction between them, but they were open and honest, and they trusted each other. Michael told Debbie he wanted to have children, but Lisa was reluctant. Then Debbie offered to be the mother of his children. She was a devoted admirer of Michael, and this move was a chance to get even closer to him, even though everyone knew they couldn't build a traditional family with Michael. He would have been content if Debbie had simply become a surrogate mother and then disappeared from his life, with no one in the press or close to him ever knowing about her existence. But when news of the pregnancy leaked, everything changed. Michael's mother, Catherine, demanded that her son marry a woman, as she couldn't bear the thought of having children out of wedlock. Michael, as always, gave in to his mother's persuasion. According to Michael and Debbie, they tried to conceive a child the traditional way, but nothing worked. In vitro fertilization came to the rescue. On February 13, 1997, he and Debbie Rowe welcomed their son, Prince Michael Jackson. Macaulay Culkin and Elizabeth Taylor served as his godparents. Words cannot describe how I feel. I have been blessed beyond all understanding, and I will work tirelessly to be the best father I can be, Michael Jackson said in an official statement to MTV immediately after Prince's birth, 1997. The family never lived in the same house. Debbie never moved to Neverland, as Lisa once did. In fact, Michael himself bought Debbie a house in the exclusive Beverly Hills neighborhood for $1.3 million and made payments of $1.5 million, although the frequency of these payments was unknown. At the end of 1997, Debbie was pregnant again, but this time she and Michael claimed the child was conceived naturally in Paris, a claim that many journalists and researchers have serious doubts about. On April 3, 1998, Michael's daughter, Paris Catherine Jackson, was born. Life for Michael and his children during those years was peaceful. Finally, they were free of scandal. And just as quiet as Michael's marriage to Debbie Rowe was, so too was their divorce. Debbie herself asked Michael to end the marriage in 1999, and Michael didn't resist. He was completely uninterested in the union and had no need for it. But another series of troubles awaited the singer. On February 21, 2002, his third child, Prince Michael Jackson II, was born. Michael would nickname him Blanket, after the English word blanket. Michael said this was a metaphor for the love and care he felt for his son. His mother's identity remains unknown. According to Michael, he used a surrogate mother, whose identity was unknown even to Jackson himself, just as the woman didn't know whose child she was carrying. Debbie Rowe confirmed that the child wasn't hers, although she presumably knew the identity of Blanket's birth mother. It was Prince Michael II whom Michael dangled from a hotel balcony in Germany in November 2002. According to Jackson, he simply wanted to show people the new addition to the family. His actions were, to say the least, unfortunate, as the baby nearly fell out of the window. The incident resulted in a huge scandal, but failed to shake Michael's established life and reputation. Unlike subsequent events. Chapter 33. Jackson's War Against Sony. In 2001, Michael decided to return to music with a new album, Invincible. Work on the album was arduous and took 3 years. Of the 50 songs recorded, 16 made the final track list. Sony, the parent label, budgeted $40 million for the production, an unimaginable sum for a single album. Invincible became the most expensive LP in history and the most disastrous of Jackson's career. The album's poor sales were blamed on a long-running conflict between Michael and his label's management. At the time, Tommy Mottola was the main producer. The fact is that in 2000, Michael planned to acquire full rights to his previous albums so he could freely dispose of his music. However, apparently following his father's example, he didn't read the contract carefully enough. According to the deal, he could only acquire the rights to the old albums if he released new ones every 2 years, and also recorded a Christmas album and several soundtracks. Furthermore, each album specified in the contract but never released gave Sony the right to add several years to the rights to Jackson's old recordings. In other words, Michael had no chance of regaining the rights to the albums honestly. This practice of acquiring rights to old recordings is not new and is still used today. In 2019, American singer Taylor Swift launched a campaign to re-record her first 6 albums due to similarly unenforceable conditions for acquiring the rights, one old album for every new one. Michael managed to break his deal with Sony thanks to a discovered conflict of interest. His lawyer also represented the studio, making it impossible to resolve. The deal was simply canceled, but Jackson was obligated to release another new album. The artist deliberately sabotaged the studio, running away from the studio, disappearing for several days, and then refusing to appear in the music videos the studio offered. He also refused to promote the album, but instead held a press conference where he accused Mariah Carey's husband, Tommy Mottola, of racism. Sony and Tommy Mottola, the president of the recording division, are a lying racist and the devil incarnate. Michael Jackson at a press conference, July 8, 2002. The album, as you might guess, sold dismally, barely surpassing 10 million copies, and Michael himself chose to forget the embarrassment of his 10th studio album. Chapter 34. Life with Michael Jackson. In 1995, Princess Diana gave a scandalous interview to journalist Martin Bashir. The Princess of Wales confessed to her unhappiness in her marriage to Charles, explaining that her husband had always felt more strongly about his longtime girlfriend, Camilla Parker, and that 3 people in one marriage felt a little cramped. Diana also boldly opened up about her mental health issues and eating disorders. The interview resonated widely, and despite its provocative nature, it endeared her to the public even more, as the world saw her as an ordinary woman with ordinary human problems. It couldn't have been better. When Martin Bashir approached Michael in 2003 with a proposal to do a similar candid interview and show his life unvarnished, Michael decided it would be good PR for him too. Diana was Michael's friend and fan. Her favorite song of Michael's was Dirty Diana, which somewhat embarrassed the artist, and following the example of a close friend was nothing new for Michael. He always learned from the best. But back then he didn't understand or didn't want to understand that his life was anything but ordinary. He was still surrounded by teenagers, his children were growing up without a mother, and Michael himself was still haunted by his reputation as an eccentric. Martin Bashir unabashedly portrayed all of Michael's eccentricities in the film, unafraid to offer caustic commentary off camera. He stated that he was wary of Michael's relationship with his children and called his relationships with other people's teenage boys strange and suspicious. Added to this was Jackson's own eccentric behavior, with stories about how he nearly kidnapped Paris from the hospital when she was born, how he froze the placentas after the births of his children, and how he never had any plastic surgery, save for 2 rhinoplasties. Of course, in the film, Michael also spoke openly about sleeping in the same room with special friends. One night, I asked him if I could stay in his bedroom, and he said yes. I said, "Michael, you have to sleep in the bed." And he said, "No, you sleep in the bed." And I kept saying no. In the end, he said, "If you love me, you'll sleep in the bed." And I was like, oh shit. So I ended up sleeping in the bed and Michael on the floor, from an interview with Gavin Arvizo in the documentary Living with Michael Jackson, 2003. The film displeased Michael, but it was no longer possible to remove it from the air under the terms of the contract between Michael and Bashir. In response to the film, which was damaging to Michael's reputation, though it could hardly be more damaging, the Jackson family released a documentary, Take Two, The Footage You Were Never Meant to See, in 2003. It included deleted footage from Bashir's shoot. Michael had deliberately decided to film the entire process with his own cameras, as well as additional commentary from his family and friends, who spoke of what a good father Michael was and how harmless he was toward children. And yet, Bashir's film had already done its job. A furor arose. Michael was once again discussed in newspapers and news channels, suspicions of pedophilia returned to the discourse, and then someone leaked the transcript of Geordie Chandler's interrogation, in which he described how and where Michael had abused him. You might have thought that this was the end of it all, but the final blow came from an unexpected source. The family of Michael's new special friend, Arvizo, accused him of molesting their 13-year-old son, Gavin. Chapter 35. The Arvizo Family. The Arvizo family came into Michael's life spontaneously. In 2002, Janet Arvizo's son, Gavin, was diagnosed with cancer. He was diagnosed with a kidney tumor weighing nearly 6 pounds. When the boy was hospitalized, comedy became his only form of entertainment. He had long been a fan of stand-up comedy and had even been taken to several stand-up shows. At one of these, the owner of the Los Angeles club where the show was taking place asked if the boy had any wishes. Gavin named several celebrities he dreamed of meeting. Michael Jackson, among them, was the easiest option to arrange a meeting. Mr. Jackson, of all people, was always happy to meet a child and entertain him. A few days later, Gavin Arvizo had already met Michael. Michael visited him in the hospital and later began paying for the boy's treatment. After his recovery, Gavin was already frolicking at Neverland with his mother and Michael. The problem was that Michael had once again welcomed a family he knew nothing about into his life. The Arvizos were a dysfunctional family with many children. Janet and David, Gavin's parents, had a terrible relationship. Their father was not allowed to see the children due to abuse. The older children and their mother were once caught shoplifting clothes from a department store. After being arrested, Janet filed a $3 million lawsuit for police brutality. A few months later, sexual assault was unexpectedly added to the charge. Of course, victims aren't always willing to immediately disclose what was done to them, or they don't immediately understand what happened. However, what's important here is that Janet agreed to a settlement when offered $137,000. The case was dismissed. Many consider this story an obvious extortion scheme, but on the other hand, it would have been difficult for a Latina woman in America in the early 2000s to fight the police in court, so taking the money wasn't such a bad idea, even if the accusations were true. As soon as the Arvizos arrived at Neverland, they immediately felt at home. At first, only Janet and Gavin stayed in the guest cottage, but within a week, practically the entire family was at the ranch. 15 children, according to Michael's former bodyguard Mark Lester, were living at Neverland, although they hadn't been officially invited. Jackson planned for the Arvizos to stay at the ranch for a week, but Janet and the children stayed for 2 months, out of sheer will. Soon after the release of Martin Bashir's film, the Santa Barbara Police Department began receiving letters of complaint and requests to reopen an investigation into Michael and his behavior. Dr. Carol Lieberman wrote a letter to Social Services. Investigations by both the police and the agency did indeed begin. Gavin Arvizo and his mother were interviewed several times, and each time they repeated that Michael was like a father to them, that he was kind and had never done anything bad to them. This testimony is documented in Social Services reports. The police investigation also led nowhere and was closed. Furthermore, during the recording of the return film, Michael's team visited the Arvizos' home and also questioned them about Gavin's connections with the artist. The family again denied everything. Despite this, Michael's lawyers advised him to stay away from the Arvizos, at least until the investigations and internal affairs were concluded. Michael, having learned his lesson from his experience with Jordy, obeyed. The Arvizo family's belongings were removed from Neverland, and they were forbidden from returning. After this, Janet and Gavin's testimony changed dramatically. Janet contacted a civil lawyer. She and her son recalled that the abuse had indeed occurred, and they wanted a peaceful settlement. In other words, they wanted to sign an agreement under which Michael would pay them a certain amount of money and they would drop the lawsuit. However, this was impossible without criminal charges, so the Arvizos went to the police with new testimony. On June 13, 2003, the Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Department received a report from Dr. Stan Katz, in which Gavin Arvizo admitted to being molested by Michael, as had his brother and sister. The documents also accused Michael of giving the children alcohol to make them more cooperative. On November 18th of that year, police conducted the second search of Neverland. Almost the entire Los Angeles police force descended on the artist's estate. On January 16, 2004, Michael Jackson was formally charged and an arrest warrant was issued. Chapter 36. The Devastating Trial. Gavin Arvizo testified in court that there were 5 instances of violence between him and Michael, most of which involved Michael giving him wine or other alcohol to make him more compliant. The abuse occurred from the moment they met until March 10, 2003, after the release of Martin Bashir's film, Michael's response film, and the Social Services interviews. In addition to Arvizo, a boy named Jason Francia, the son of a maid who worked at Neverland, testified against Jackson. He also testified about being abused by Michael when Jason was 7 years old. The Francia family's testimony was supported by several permanent employees of Neverland Ranch. June Chandler also testified for the prosecution. Her son was not allowed to testify. The prosecutor in the case was again Thomas Snedon, who had handled the investigation in 1993 and was present during Michael's strip search. According to Michael's defense, since the previous case ended with Jackson buying off the Chandlers, Snedden had a grudge against Michael, having failed to bring such a high-profile case to trial. Now, when the opportunity arose, he seized it and squeezed everything he could out of the charges against Michael to send the biggest star on the planet to prison. Michael's brothers and sisters, LaToya had already reunited with her family, friends, his ex-wife Debbie Rowe, and former employees of Motown, where Michael launched his high-profile career, as well as 2 special friends of Michael's, Wade Robson and George Barnes, spoke on his behalf. The most famous of the children around Michael who testified on his behalf was actor Macaulay Culkin. He appeared in Michael's music video for Black or White. It's worth noting that Jimmy Safechuck, like Jordy, was not allowed to testify, despite attempts by the defense to have him present. According to Safechuck's statements in the acclaimed 2019 film Leaving Neverland, he recanted because he believed Michael was guilty. However, according to court documents, it was the judge who barred Jimmy from being called as a witness for either side. As for Wade Robson, he also changed his testimony in 2019, claiming he was staying with Michael at Neverland in 1990 when the artist began abusing him. Robson claimed his family was supposed to go to the Grand Canyon, but Michael suggested they stay at Neverland. 2 days later, the family left for the Grand Canyon, while Wade remained at the ranch. Wade also described the locations where the abuse occurred, including the famous train depot, which had a huge floral clock in front of the entrance. I was thrilled, and Michael was thrilled. The whole family left, and we had 5 days, just me and Michael, Wade Robson said in the 2019 documentary Leaving Neverland. However, these claims turned out to be false, as according to Wade's mother's 1993 testimony, when she was questioned in Michael's previous case, after 2 days at Neverland, they all left for the Grand Canyon together, and Wade was not left alone with Michael. She also confirmed that Jackson did indeed sleep in the same bed with her children, but she was present in the room and didn't notice anything unusual. "No, my son never stayed at the ranch without me until this year, 1993, Joy Robson's 1993 testimony. Furthermore, the train station where Wade claims he was abused in 1990 was built only in 1993, according to construction plans for that part of the Neverland complex and old photographs of the ranch for that year. Back in 2005, when Robson was still testifying for Michael, the defense advanced 2 lines. First, the lawyers pointed out several inconsistencies and discrepancies in the Arvizo family's testimony, which were indeed present in the case file. Second, the defense presented the jury with Michael's children and friends, who claimed that even if Jackson put them to sleep in his bed, there was no sexual intercourse between them. The case lasted almost 4 months, and during that time Michael had changed significantly. While at the first hearings he seemed full of energy and confidence, climbing onto the roof of his car to greet the fans surrounding the courthouse, by the end he seemed exhausted, haggard, and distant. He increasingly relied on painkillers and other drugs, so much so that many thought his consciousness was clouded. Michael simply faded, as if he no longer existed in this world, in this courtroom, in Neverland. Only a shell remained. Chapter 37. Sentencing. Michael's case involved 14 counts, each of which the jury had to decide. Conspiracy, 1 count. Indecent acts with a minor, 4 counts. Attempted indecent acts with a minor, 1 count. Use of a mind-altering substance to facilitate the commission of a felony, 4 counts. And furnishing alcoholic beverages to persons under 21, 4 counts. On June 13, 2005, the jury delivered its verdict. Hundreds, if not thousands, of fans with signs gathered around the courthouse. A cordon had to be set up to ensure security. The entire country, and indeed the world, listened to the news with bated breath and waited for the jury's verdict. That's it. Not guilty on all 10 remaining counts, Michael Jackson will walk out of this courtroom a free man, acquitted of serious, especially serious, and lesser charges. I think it's fair to say many people will be surprised, but you don't have to be a lawyer to understand that this is a complete victory for Michael Jackson and a defeat for Thomas Snedden, the prosecutor who prosecuted Jackson for over a decade, from a live broadcast on CNN, June 13, 2005. Michael was fully acquitted, and that same morning he walked out of the courtroom a completely free man, acquitted of all molestation charges. Within 4 months, it was unequivocally proven that Jackson had not committed any of the crimes attributed to him. All subsequent accusations that arose after the artist's death were also refuted by investigators, journalists, and private investigators. Of course, Michael's behavior was bizarre. Sleeping in the same bed with other people's children isn't the best idea after all, but Jackson likely either didn't understand why this was wrong or didn't want to understand. Being surrounded by adults he barely knew was commonplace during his childhood. Chapter 38. The Calm. After his acquittal, Michael and his children went to Bahrain to disappear for a while, and, it seems for the first time in his career, since the release of I Want You Back in 1969, Jackson actually succeeded. In the Persian Gulf country, Michael stayed with the Prince of Bahrain and didn't contact anyone in the States. His family repeatedly invited him home for the holidays, and Joseph even counted on another tour with his brothers. Indeed, the timing for Michael's triumphant return was perfect. He had won, he was a free man, the world seemed to believe him, and Jackson himself was still young enough to release a couple of successful albums and go on a world tour. But Michael was increasingly uninterested in this. He suffered from panic attacks, post-traumatic stress disorder, insomnia, and regularly visited a therapist. For the first time in his life, his career took a back seat. Besides, he was busy with his children. After some time, Jackson returned to the United States, but not to Los Angeles, which had already become his home, but to Las Vegas, where he and his children lived a nomadic lifestyle, moving from one rented house to another. According to his bodyguards, by this time he was allowing his children to see their grandmother, Catherine, and was gradually returning to the workforce. However, the fire in Michael's eyes was gone. He no longer needed records, groundbreaking recordings, or large-scale performances. He wanted to fulfill all his obligations and pay off the debts he had accumulated to his label. For the next few years, Michael devoted all his free time exclusively to his children. They were his main escape. They went shopping together, celebrated birthdays, and traveled. Michael never returned to the deserted Neverland estate. Chapter 40. That's It. In 2007, Michael began work on a new album but was never able to complete it. In addition to a lack of inspiration and vision for his future creative path, Michael faced serious financial difficulties. The fact is that over the last 10 years of his career, Michael had accumulated a huge debt to Sony. He released music rarely, spending huge amounts of money on recordings that he was unable to repay the label. Furthermore, his lifestyle and legal battles were seriously damaging sales. His albums simply stopped selling. Fundamental financial difficulties prompted Michael to accept an offer for a series of concerts at the O2 Arena in London. Michael agreed to 10 shows, but during preparations it turned out that the organizers were expecting him to perform 50 shows due to high demand. He was scheduled to play these in 2009. Physically, Jackson was hardly capable of such a strain, but the offer was irresistible, and he really needed the money. The King of Pop's return was planned and titled, "This Is It, That's It." That's it. I just want to say that these will be my last concerts in London. That will be it. When I say, "This is it," I mean it. I'm going to sing the songs my fans want to hear. This is truly it. Final call. See you in July. Love you. Michael Jackson's statement about his concerts at London's O2 Stadium, 2009. Even though Michael wasn't thrilled with the idea of the concerts at the beginning of preparations, once rehearsals began, he embraced the process and was thrilled to be on stage. According to those who worked with him during this period, he was full of energy and offered many ideas for future shows. And yet, during this period, Michael was still taking a huge amount of medication, painkillers, and sleeping pills. His addiction was at its peak. This is also confirmed by the accounts of his acquaintances. He was often delirious, unresponsive to the words of those around him, and intoxicated. 3 weeks before the London concerts, all plans were ruined once and for all. Chapter 41. A Day Unforgettable. On June 25, 2009, Michael Jackson died. One of Michael's many personal physicians, Conrad Murray, administered a dose of propofol that day, a sedative often used to maintain anesthesia. In recent years, Michael's main complaints were not so much muscle pain or anxiety, but insomnia. To cope with it, he demanded such powerful medications. Sometimes he even requested general anesthesia, and many doctors agreed to provide it for money. Naturally, each time, as with any addiction, Michael needed to increase the dose. That day, Michael suffered an intoxication, and his heart stopped. Normal circulation of oxygen-rich blood supports the functioning of the kidneys, lungs, brain, and other vital organs. If you take medications that at high doses are toxic enough to cause cardiac arrest or suppress the respiratory center, oxygen will no longer be distributed reliably throughout the body. Without restoring breathing and restarting the heart, death will occur. This is precisely what happened to Michael. The death of Michael Joseph Jackson like his entire life, was transformed into a spectacle. The funeral of the King of Pop was broadcast live with the permission of his family. The gold coffin in which the artist lay was carried on the shoulders of his brothers. The investigation into the artist's death led to charges being brought against Michael's personal physician, Conrad Murray, who administered a sedative. He received a 4-year prison sentence for manslaughter but was released after only 2. According to Michael's will, all of his property and fortune, as well as custody of his children, were transferred to the Michael Jackson Family Trust, currently managed by Michael's mother, Katherine Jackson. In the event of her death or incapacitation, Michael's mentor, Diana Ross, will be the legal successor. She remained his close friend until the very end. Chapter 42. In Memory of Michael. On September 13, 2009, one of the music industry's premier awards shows, the MTV Video Music Awards, opened with a performance dedicated to Michael Jackson. It featured dancers from Michael's aborted residency, This Is It, and those who worked with him throughout his career. They performed to a medley of his hits, centered around the song Thriller. The performance concluded with a performance by Michael's sister, Janet Jackson, of their collaboration, Scream. Janet sang and danced while Michael was by her side on screen. Since his death, several books and over 18 documentaries have been published about Michael Jackson. His albums are reissued on anniversary dates, and artists continue to find inspiration in his work to this day. In 2019, Graham King secured the rights to produce a film about the life of Michael Jackson. Lionsgate has been developing the project since 2022. The premiere is expected on October 3, 2025. According to the creators, the film will cover the artist's entire life, from birth to death. Additionally, we will be able to hear over 30 of his songs, and iconic performances and music videos will be recreated. The film's budget was $150 million, making it the most expensive musician biopic ever made. The cast includes Coleman Domingo and Nia Long as Joseph and Katherine Jackson, Kat Graham as Diana Ross, Lawrence Tate as Berry Gordy, and Kendrick Sampson as Quincy Jones. Michael Jackson will be played by his nephew, Jermaine Jackson's son, Jafar Jackson. Here ends the story that began in the small town of Gary, Indiana. Having traveled the entire story of Michael Jackson's life and career, it's still difficult to understand what he truly was. However, one thing is certain. Michael was more than just a man with an interesting life. He faced many terrible trials along the way, and while he wasn't able to overcome them all without harboring resentment, those closest to him always saw something bright in him. Which means there truly was a light within him. But moreover, Michael Jackson was a unique phenomenon in the world of music, conquering the entire music industry, revolutionizing it, and always remaining outside the box. This world belonged to Michael Jackson, and everyone else simply lived in it, said John Randall Taraborelli, journalist and friend of Michael. The incomparable Michael Jackson had more influence on music than any other artist in history. He was magic himself. Beyoncé singer. When we worked together on the video for Bad, I was as in awe of the absolute mastery of his movements as I was of the music. Every step he took was so precise, so fluid. It was like watching Mercury in motion. Martin Scorsese, film director. From the very beginning of my career, he was my idol. I even had a poster of him on my wall. Celine Dion, singer. He broke barriers, changed the format of radio. With his music, he made it possible for Barack Obama and Oprah Winfrey to influence the world. His legacy is unparalleled. Usher, singer. He influenced me more than anyone else. Missy Elliott, rap artist. He was the greatest musician, a true gentleman and a very kind person. I will always love him. Whitney Houston, singer. He is more talented than anyone in the world. Liza Minnelli, actress. Just as there will never be another Fred Astaire, Chuck Berry, or Elvis Presley, no one will ever compare to Michael Jackson. His talent, his ability to surprise, his enigma made him a legend. Steven Spielberg, film director. What can you say about Michael Jackson? He is one of the most recognized artists in the world, an innovator in songwriting, whose dances seemed to defy gravity and drew inspiration from the works of Fred Astaire and Gene Kelly, whom he adored. Jacqueline Kennedy, former First Lady of the United States. Subscribe and like.